Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Whether you're listening from your bed, curled up in a warm nest of blankets, or drifting through that quiet space where thoughts begin to blur, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're traveling back 252 million years to the moment when Earth's story almost ended. This was the end of the Permian period and the beginning of something unimaginable. It began with fire. Across what is now Siberia, volcanoes erupted for nearly a million years without pause. Ash filled the skies, turning sunlight into a dull red haze. The air grew heavy with carbon and poison. Rain fell as acid, stripping the land bare. The oceans, once blue and full of life, became stagnant green and suffocating. Coral reefs dissolved, forests withered. Even the insects, life's most tireless survivors, nearly vanished. By the time the earth grew still again, over 90% of all living species were gone. Entire ecosystems collapsed in weeks. The seas emptied, the land fell quiet, and for a moment, it seemed the planet itself had stopped breathing. It was the greatest extinction in history, an event scientists call the Great Dying. And in the fragile stillness that followed, something new began to stir. Not recovery, but rebirth. From the ashes of extinction, life began again. Strange creatures began to rise from the wastelands, scaled, cold-blooded, and unlike anything the planet had ever seen. Some had teeth like knives and tails that whipped through the air. Others slid between land and water, neither fish nor lizard. Some soared on thin, leathery wings, the first vertebrates ever to claim the sky. This was the dawn of the Triassic, the beginning of the age of reptiles. But how did this new world come alive so quickly? Why did reptiles, and not the mammal-like creatures that came before, seize control of the earth? And what strange forms did life take during this restless age of recovery, when everything on the planet seemed to be reinventing itself? Tonight, we'll drift softly through that forgotten dawn of the Triassic rebirth, when strange new creatures invaded the world. But before we begin, if you enjoy these slow journeys into deep time, gentle, soothing, and quietly filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this one a gentle like and perhaps tapped subscribe. It helps other curious minds discover this peaceful little corner of the internet, and it lets the algorithm know that sleep and science go perfectly together. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see just how far across the world these sleepy science stories reach. So now take a deep breath, let it go, and together let's step softly into the time when the strangest creatures Earth had ever seen began to invade the world. When the silence lifted, the world that emerged was nothing like the one that had come before. The continents had merged into one vast body of land, a single supercontinent that scientists now call Pangia. From one pole to the other, it stretched like a scar across the planet, surrounded by a restless ocean that steamed beneath the heavy sun. There were no blue forests to soften its edges, no carpets of green moss or winding rivers filled with life. Only a red, sunburned earth that shimmered beneath a sky still heavy with ash. The air was thin and sharp, almost metallic. Breathing here would have felt like standing at the top of a mountain, every breath shallow and unsatisfying. Oxygen was scarce, only half of what fills our lungs today. Fires struggled to burn, and creatures that wished to survive had to move slowly, conserving every breath like treasure. Across this barren land, heat rose in shimmering waves. The horizon blurred until the ground seemed to melt into the sky. Monsoons arrived without warning, dumping torrents of water that cut deep scars into the soil before vanishing again for years. Inland seas came and went like ghosts, shrinking and swelling with the rhythm of the climate. Salt crusted their edges. Winds carried dust across thousands of miles, smoothing stones and burying bones. The surface of Pangaea was restless. The earth cracked and heaved with the memory of the volcanoes that had once torn it open. Lava still glowed beneath its crust, breathing heat through fissures and valleys. Even after the storms had cleared and the skies began to pale, the land seemed unsure of itself, as if life's absence had left a hollow too deep to fill. In this raw world, time felt stretched. Seasons lasted longer, their boundaries faint and uneven. Summers burned without mercy. Winters were cruel and thin. The poles saw ice only briefly before it melted back into the sea. No region could be called safe. The planet was rebuilding itself, but it did not yet remember what balance felt like. And yet, even here, the first hints of life began to stir again. Tiny plants clung to the edges of drying riverbeds, their roots gripping the soil as if afraid to let go. They were the quiet pioneers, the first to reclaim a foothold in the wasteland. Where moisture lingered, thin mats of algae shimmered green against the red dust. In those small patches of color, the planet's pulse began to return. The oceans, too, were beginning to heal. Though still tainted with chemicals and low in oxygen, the tides began to move with purpose again. The sun's warmth pulled water upward, creating slow, gentle currents. These shifting layers allowed life to begin its work. Bacteria and plankton stirring in the shallows, weaving invisible threads that would one day form the web of the sea again. But for now, the planet was quiet, too quiet. Every sound carried for miles, the soft hiss of wind over sand, the distant crack of stone as the land adjusted to its own weight, the low rumble of thunder that rolled endlessly along the horizon. There were no bird calls, no insect hum, no chorus of life to fill the air, only the planet itself, breathing faintly through heat and dust. It was a world without memory. All that had been learned through hundreds of millions of years, how to build reefs, how to weave forests, how to fill the air with song, was gone. Life would have to start again from the ground up, rediscovering everything it had once known. Yet within that emptiness lay a strange kind of freedom. Evolution had been given a clean slate. There were no towering predators to fear, no ancient forests to compete with, no established rhythms to follow. Every form of life that would come next would do so without precedent, shaped only by the chaos that surrounded it. Somewhere in the warmth of a shallow sea, the first gill flickered. In the shadow of a red dune, a creature no larger than a hand pressed its belly against the cooling sand. In the silence that stretched across continents, tiny hearts began to beat again. The earth was reinventing itself, molecule by molecule, breath by breath. It did not remember the coral kingdoms or the forests of its past, and so it created new worlds entirely, new shapes, new instincts, new beginnings. Pangaea, vast and empty, was a stage waiting for its players. The air shimmered with heat, the land trembled with change, and the oceans whispered faint promises of renewal. From this fragile and forgotten canvas, the story of life would begin once more, not as it had been, but as something altogether new. The world that followed the great dying was not one of abundance. It was quiet, brittle, and strangely hollow, as if the planet had forgotten how to breathe. The land stretched vast and empty beneath a pale sun, and for a long time it seemed that life itself had chosen not to return. But beneath stones, in burrows, and in the shallow corners of the remaining seas, something still moved. Tiny hearts still beat in the silence. They were not mighty creatures. They had no armor, no towering size, no splendor to match the vanished kingdoms of the past. The ones who endured were small, unassuming, and hidden from the worst of the world's fury. In the dry soil of Pangaea, little amphibians clung to the damp edges of streams. Their skin glistened like wet clay, their lungs fragile, their movements patient. They lived in places where the sun could not reach too fiercely, where water gathered in brief pools after the rare rains. When the heat grew unbearable, they retreated underground, curling into the cool darkness, waiting for the world above to soften again. Close by, other creatures stirred in the shadows, the synapsids, ancient relatives of mammals. These were the quiet architects of the future, though nothing about them suggested destiny. They were small, furred, and weary, with faces that still carried the shape of their reptilian past. They tunneled through the earth, their claws scraping against the packed soil, carving narrow passageways that held both safety and silence. Life, in its most fragile forms, had found a way to endure by turning inward. On the surface, early reptiles wandered cautiously through the red dust. They were thin limbed and restless, their skin a patchwork of scales and scars. They drank from shallow puddles, hunted insects among the stones, and watched the horizon for signs of storms. Unlike the lumbering beasts that had ruled before, they were built for heat and hunger. Their lungs were stronger, their hearts pumped faster. They could go longer without food or water, and when the world turned harsh, they did not retreat. They adapted. These survivors carried more than their bodies through time. Inside them, hidden in their blood and bones, was the story of everything that would come after. Evolution had narrowed to a thread, a single fragile rope holding the future of life together. Scientists call this a genetic bottleneck, a moment when the variety of life collapses into a handful of survivors, and all that follows is built from their limited pieces. Every mammal, every bird, every reptile that now walks, swims, or flies traces its ancestry to this quiet handful of species that refuse to disappear. They were the foundation stones on which the next great age would be built. But their survival was not luck alone. Each of them carried within them traits that matched the world's new demands. The amphibians knew how to wait, to slow their hearts and sleep through years of drought. The synapsids had warmth, a faint whisper of the metabolism that would one day power mammalian endurance, and the reptiles had strength, lungs that could draw breath from thin air, and scales that trapped precious moisture inside. Together, they represented three answers to the same question: how to live when the earth itself seemed unwilling to host life. There were no forests yet to shelter them, no reefs to hide within, no great rivers to drink from, but beneath the barren quiet, life's memory was beginning to stir again. In the soil, bacteria multiplied, weaving new cycles of decay and renewal. In the shallow waters, algae bloomed faintly, feeding the tiny organisms that would one day become the architects of new ecosystems. Every beat of a heart, every flick of a tail, every breath drawn beneath the crushing heat was a small defiance against extinction. Slowly, the planet's emptiness began to fill again, not with abundance, but with persistence. Over time, these survivors began to change. The synapsids grew more complex, their teeth dividing into shapes for cutting and grinding, their bodies warming with a more constant internal heat. Some began to sprout thin hairs, soft and fine, to hold warmth in the cold desert nights. The reptiles, meanwhile, stretched their limbs and lifted their bellies higher off the ground, learning to walk with greater balance. Each step they took reshaped the blueprint of motion itself. And in the mud, the amphibians continued to watch, their lives unchanged but essential, silent witnesses to the unfolding of a new era. It was from these small, unremarkable beings that the next age would rise. They were not conquerors or kings, they were the caretakers of existence, holding the thread of life when everything else had fallen away. From their fragile persistence came the first great experiments of the Triassic, the creatures that would fill the skies, the seas, and the endless deserts. But for now, the world remained quiet, and its few survivors went about their days unseen, rebuilding the living earth one heartbeat at a time. The silence of extinction had passed, replaced by something even more profound, the slow, steady whisper of beginnings. Even as life began to rebuild itself, the earth was still haunted by what had nearly destroyed it. The scars of the past were everywhere, written into the stone and sky. Beneath the continents, molten rock still pulsed like a faint heartbeat, reminding the planet that its long fever had not fully broken. The world that had once drowned in flame was now learning to breathe again, though each breath came with a trace of ash. Far to the north, the ancient wounds of the Siberian traps still bled their heat into the air. The land there was black and broken, a field of cooled lava that stretched farther than the eye could see. Each layer of rock told a story of eruptions that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, when rivers of fire had poured across the land and the skies had glowed a dull red for generations. Even now, long after the eruptions had ended, gases still seeped quietly from cracks in the ground. They rose unseen into the air, thin but powerful, like the faint smoke of a world still smoldering. Those invisible gases, especially carbon dioxide, changed everything. They wrapped the planet in a thickening blanket of heat, trapping sunlight that would once have escaped into space. Slowly, the world began to bake. In the heart of Pangia, where the continents joined and no ocean winds could reach, the air grew blistering. Temperatures soared past 45 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher. Days stretched long under a brutal sun, and the ground itself shimmered with heat. The soil cracked, its surface turning pale and salty. Nothing could root deeply here for long. These central deserts spread like a tide of dust, glowing red beneath a pale sky. Dunes moved silently across the land, shaped by dry winds that carried sand for miles. Here and there, a lonely creature left a line of tracks that vanished moments later beneath the drifting surface. Even the shadows looked thin in this place, but the world was not entirely barren. Along the coasts, where the air met the sea, a different rhythm began to stir. Moisture gathered in the winds that rolled in from the Panthalassic Ocean, and there, near the edges of continents, rain began to fall again. It came heavy and sudden, like a blessing. Seeds that had slept in the soil awoke. Ferns uncurled their delicate fronds. Moss crept across stone, and conifers lifted their green spires into the hazy light. These narrow bands of life became the planet's lungs. They breathed in the carbon that thickened the sky and exhaled oxygen into a world that desperately needed it. Forests stretched cautiously along rivers and coastal plains, green ribbons against the desert's endless red. In their shade, the air cooled slightly. Small creatures emerged from their burrows to hunt among the ferns, their movements quick and wary. Rainforests grew in patches, fragile but alive. Each drop of rain that touched the soil carried the promise of renewal, yet even here the balance was delicate. Too much heat and the plants withered. Too little rain and the rivers vanished again, leaving behind cracked beds where amphibians once hid their eggs. Life survived, but it did so at the edge of exhaustion. Volcanoes still dotted the horizon in many places, faint plumes rising like thin gray feathers into the sky. They were smaller now, less violent, but their presence lingered as a reminder of how unstable the earth remained. The crust groaned under its own heat, and earthquakes occasionally rippled through the land, toppling cliffs into the sea. In the air above, dust from distant eruptions painted the sunsets in colors that defied description, gold fading into crimson, crimson melting into violet. It was beauty born from ruin, a soft reflection of a planet still trying to steady itself. In this fragile world, life had to be clever. Plants spread their roots deeper to reach hidden moisture. Reptiles developed scales thick enough to hold in water. Some creatures learned to hunt in the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, resting through the searing days. Others took to the shadows of rocks or to burrows beneath the sand, where the air was just cool enough to breathe. The earth itself seemed to be testing its creations, shaping them through hardship. Each drought, each storm, each searing gust of wind was a quiet sculptor, chipping away at what could not endure. What survived did so not through strength, but through patience. And yet, amid the struggle, the planet began to find a rhythm again. The heat no longer climbed without end. Winds learned new paths, bringing the scent of the sea farther inland. Clouds gathered more often over the coasts. Though the earth was still unstable, there were moments of calm, small pauses where the balance held just long enough for life to take another step forward. In these moments, the world seemed almost peaceful. The deserts glowed like copper beneath the sun. The forests hummed softly with the sound of insects, and the shallow seas shimmered with green light. The scars of fire remained, but they no longer defined everything. The planet was still recovering, still uncertain, yet it had begun to dream again. From a world of fire and ash, something delicate was beginning to grow, the slow heartbeat of a living earth learning, once more, how to survive itself. Once the earth had quieted and the skies began to clear, something remarkable started to unfold. The planet, scarred but alive, was ready to begin again. The silence that had once filled the deserts and oceans began to break, not with the return of old life, but with the arrival of something entirely new. Evolution, freed from its former boundaries, began to play again, cautious at first, then bold, then wildly inventive. The great dying had emptied the stage. In its wake, there were no kings or rulers of ecosystems, no ancient forests or coral cities to set the rules. The world was an open canvas, and life, restless, tireless, and endlessly curious, began to experiment. In the shallow seas, sunlight filtered through green waters, falling on shapes that looked both familiar and strange. Some creatures moved like fish, but carried the bones of reptiles. Their bodies twisted between forms, as if the world itself was unsure of what a swimmer should look like. Fins began to stretch into limbs, and scales took on textures never seen before. From the same blueprint of bone and muscle, countless designs emerged, each one testing a different idea of what survival could mean. On land, the red earth that had once been barren began to ripple with movement. Tiny reptiles scurried across the dunes, their shadows darting like insects. They came in all sizes and shapes, some with long snouts and slender legs, others flat and armored, like walking shields. A few could run upright for a few precious moments, balancing on their hind limbs as they sprinted from danger. It was a strange sight, awkward and elegant at the same time. The first experiments in a posture that would one day define the great dinosaurs. In the cooler hours of dawn, the mammal-like synapsids emerged from their burrows. Their bodies were low to the ground, their ribs expanding as they breathed the thin air. Some had started to grow soft coverings on their skin, thin strands that may have held warmth or shielded them from the sun. Their teeth were already evolving into patterns of specialization, sharp blades for slicing, rounded molars for grinding. It was as if evolution had split itself into 1,000 directions at once, letting every possibility take form, just to see which might endure. Even the insects, which had nearly vanished in the planet's collapse, began to reappear in dazzling variety. Their wings shimmered like fragments of colored glass, scattering the sunlight into patterns of green and gold. Dragonflies, beetles, and early ancestors of today's pollinators traced delicate paths between the new plants that clung to life along rivers and coastlines. With every flutter and hum, they carried energy through the growing web of life, knitting together the planet's first fragile ecosystems once more. But this time, there was something different in the way life grew. It was as if the laws of evolution had loosened. With so much of the planet empty, there was room to take risks, to try new forms without fear of competition. Each mutation, each adaptation, could lead to something entirely unique. The fossil record from this time is filled with creatures that defy simple description. Some looked part reptile, part amphibian, their skin blending scales and soft tissue. Others had skulls shaped in ways that no living animal could match, wide and flat, or narrow and needle like, filled with teeth of uneven size. Some bodies stretched long like eels, but ended in feet instead of fins. Others bore the first hints of features that would one day define mammals and birds: warm blood, lighter bones, faster hearts. The Triassic world became a workshop of endless invention. On every continent, in every shallow sea, nature tested ideas in rapid succession. Some would vanish as quickly as they appeared, while others would become the foundation for future empires of life. Predators learned to hunt again, but in new ways. Without the vast forests of the past, they relied on speed and cunning instead of ambush. Scavengers returned to the carcasses left behind, developing keener senses and stronger jaws. Herbivores found ways to survive on the tough plants that dotted the land, their teeth grinding through fibrous leaves that few others could digest. Every shape that moved across the land seemed to be part of an ongoing conversation between the earth and its inhabitants. The climate demanded resilience, the thin air demanded efficiency, the open world demanded imagination, and life answered, again and again, reshaping itself to fill every empty corner. In time, this chaos began to form patterns. From the experimental flood of species, certain lineages began to stand out, those that could endure the heat, breathe the thin air, and walk with balance on the shifting soil. They were not yet the masters of the world, but they were its pioneers, the first to carve stability from uncertainty. To look at the fossil beds from this time is to see creativity fossilized, bones that capture the moment before rules were rewritten. It is evolution at its most daring, where the strange and the impossible briefly became real. The earth, once silent and scarred, had become a world of motion again. In the space between extinction and stability, life had rediscovered its spark. It was not merely rebuilding what was lost, it was inventing something entirely new, the second great experiment in the story of life. Across the red valleys of the young Triassic world, rivers began to return. They wound their way through cracked soil and shallow floodplains, glittering under the same pale sun that had scorched the deserts. These were not the calm rivers we know today. They were wild and unpredictable, swelling into torrents after heavy rains, then shrinking back to muddy threads that carved through the dust. Yet wherever water lingered, life gathered, timid at first, then daring, and finally hungry. Here, in these restless waterways, the first great hunters of the New Age appeared. Their names would be known only to fossils in memory, among them Proterosuchus, one of the earliest predators to reclaim the Earth's flooded edges. It was not large by modern standards, perhaps the size of a crocodile, but in this newborn ecosystem it was a giant. Its body stretched long and low to the ground, its tail thick and muscular, its snout drawn into a slight hook at the tip, as if designed for both biting and tearing. At first glance, Proterosuchus looked much like the crocodiles that would follow millions of years later. Its skin was patterned with small, hard scales that caught the light like dull armor. Its limbs splayed outward, and it could move both through water and across land with ease. But this creature was not yet the master of either. It was an experiment in predation, a bridge between the past and the creatures that would one day rule the swamps and seas. The rivers of Pangia were its hunting ground. The water was murky, rich with silt and life returning in cautious abundance. Small fish darted between reeds, Amphibians slid quietly through the shallows, and insects hovered just above the surface. In this fragile web of new beginnings, Proterosuchus waited. Fossil evidence suggests that these early predators were ambush hunters. They would lie half submerged, still as driftwood, their eyes just above the surface. When something small ventured too close, a fish, a lizard, or a careless amphibian, the stillness would break in an instant. With a rush of water and a flash of teeth, the prey was gone. This was survival through patience and precision. Proterosuchus did not chase its food across open ground, it waited for the world to come to it. And when the rivers dried, as they often did, it adapted again, scavenging whatever remained on the cracked banks. The same jaws that caught fish could tear into the carcass of a fallen reptile. Its teeth were conical, not designed for chewing, but for gripping, a design that would later become a hallmark of reptilian hunters. Flexibility was its greatest advantage. While other species depended on stable conditions, Proterosuchus could shift its habits with the landscape. It was as much a scavenger as a hunter, as much a land creature as a swimmer. This versatility allowed it to thrive where others could not. In a world still recovering from chaos, that adaptability was the truest form of power. Scientists believe that the ancestors of Proterosuchus had survived the extinction by hiding in river systems, places where the water buffered against the heat and ash. Now, their descendants ruled those same waters. They were not gentle rulers, but they brought movement back to the rivers, balance to the silence. For the first time since the Great Dying, the food chain was rebuilding itself from the bottom up, and at its top sat this strange, half-formed reptile that hunted by instinct and opportunity. Around it, the ecosystem was slowly knitting itself together. Insects swarmed the river's edge, laying eggs in the damp soil. Small amphibians lurked among the reeds, their slick bodies glistening in the low light. Early reptiles slithered between rocks, their movements cautious. Life was learning to coexist again, and predators like Proterosuchus were shaping that lesson through fear and necessity. When storms rolled across the continent, the rivers transformed into temporary oceans. Whole plains vanished beneath the surge. In those moments, Proterosuchus moved easily through the floodwaters, propelled by its tail, its body cutting through the current like a shadow. When the waters receded, it crawled onto the steaming banks, its scales glinting faintly as it basked in the aftermath. This rhythm, flood and drought, water and dust, became the pulse of its existence. Each new season reshaped the landscape, and with it, the hunters who ruled it. Over time, the lineage of Proterosuchus would branch into new forms, each more specialized than the last. Some would become faster, others would grow heavier, better suited for the deep. The lessons learned by these first river predators, patience, versatility, endurance, would echo across millions of years, shaping the evolution of crocodiles, marine reptiles, and even the mighty dinosaurs that were still only whispers in the future. But here, in the early Triassic, it was all just beginning. The rivers shimmered under a molten sky, carrying silt from the mountains into wide floodplains, and in their slow, winding paths, shadows moved beneath the water, long, sinuous forms that watched the edges of the world with hungry, ancient eyes. The rise of the river predators marked a turning point. For the first time since the planet had burned, life hunted life again. The quiet balance of survival had returned, and with it, the first heartbeat of competition that would drive the next great chapter of evolution. In the rippling shallows of a world reborn, Earth was remembering what it meant to be alive. In a world still trembling from disaster, when most creatures had vanished into silence, one small being endured. It was not graceful, nor fierce, nor even particularly clever by our standards. Yet it survived when almost nothing else did. Its name was Lystrosaurus, and for a brief, improbable moment in Earth's history, it became the ruler of a broken world. The land it inherited was harsh beyond imagination. Great deserts stretched where forests had once grown, their red dunes shimmering beneath the burning light. The air was thin and dry, the rivers unreliable, and storms came without warning. Most animals could not bear such conditions. They needed shade, or moisture, or food that simply no longer existed. But Lystrosaurus did not demand much from the world. It simply learned to bend with it. About the size of a small pig, Lystrosaurus carried itself low to the ground, with sturdy limbs and a wide, rounded body built for endurance. Its face was unmistakable, short and beak-like, with two small tusks curving from its upper jaw. It was neither reptile nor mammal, but something in between, a synapsid from an age before the two groups had fully parted ways. Its skin, likely leathery and bare, held moisture close. Its ribs expanded wide to fit strong lungs, a gift in an atmosphere still thin with oxygen. It did not chase or flee or fight. It wandered, feeding on the hardy plants that clung to life near riverbanks or along the edges of floodplains. When the heat became too great, it dug. Lystrosaurus was a burrower, carving tunnels into the soft soil to escape the sun and the choking air. There, in the dim quiet beneath the surface, it rested. Some scientists believe it could enter a kind of hibernation, slowing its heartbeat, breathing less often, waiting out the worst seasons until the rains returned. In this way, it endured when so many others could not. Fossils of Lystrosaurus have been found scattered across the world, from the deserts of South Africa to the icy rocks of Antarctica and even the plains of India and China. In its time, these regions were connected as part of the vast supercontinent, Pangia. The animal's wide distribution tells us something remarkable, that it was not a creature bound by boundaries or climate. It adapted to almost anywhere it could walk. From tropical floodplains to cold polar forests, it managed to survive. In the early Triassic, perhaps as much as 9 out of 10 land animals belonged to this single genus. Imagine that, an entire world where one humble herbivore dominated nearly every landscape. The rivers would have echoed with its low grunts. Herds of them would have moved slowly across the plains, their short legs kicking up dust as they grazed. In the quiet mornings, they might have gathered at shrinking pools to drink, their reflections rippling in the still heat. It was not dominance through power or cunning, it was dominance through patience, the very traits that made Lystrosaurus seem plain. Its small size, simple habits, and calm endurance were the ones that carried it through. It could survive on little food. It could live in thin air. It could rest for months beneath the ground while others perished above. To modern eyes, it might seem unremarkable, yet its story is one of quiet triumph. Lystrosaurus was a bridge across extinction, carrying the thread of life from one age into the next. Every creature that would come after, every reptile, every mammal, even us, inherited something from the perseverance of creatures like it. In its bones, scientists see the echo of a lesson written into evolution itself, that survival is not always granted to the strongest or the fiercest, but to those who can wait, adapt, and endure. The skeleton of Lystrosaurus tells this story clearly. Its lungs were built for shallow air, its ribs curved wide to draw breath efficiently. Its limbs, short but powerful, ended in sturdy claws perfect for digging. Its tusks, small but sharp, may have helped it root through dry soil in search of hidden roots or tubers. Each part of its body reflected a life spent adjusting, finding balance where none seemed possible. Even its eyes, set high on its skull, hint at a creature alert to danger yet unhurried by fear. It had no need to run far. Its safety lay in stillness, in retreating beneath the earth, in waiting until the heat passed. And so it did, generation after generation, while the earth continued to shift and rebuild around it. For millions of years, Lystrosaurus lived quietly in a world still uncertain of itself. Eventually, as the climate stabilized and new predators rose, it faded from the fossil record. But by then, it had already done its part. It had carried life through the narrowest passage in history, holding steady when nearly everything else had fallen away. When paleontologists uncover its fossils today, they often find them in great numbers, clustered together as if even in death they refused to be alone. Perhaps they sought safety in herds, or perhaps the rivers that once sustained them claimed them together when they finally dried. However it happened, their presence across the continents tells a single, enduring truth. Life, even in its simplest form, is astonishingly persistent. In a world of fire, ash, and uncertainty, Lystrosaurus was proof that survival itself can be an act of quiet grace. It was the small monarch of the deserts, the unheralded survivor that kept the story of Earth moving forward, one steady heartbeat at a time. The deserts of Pangia were beginning to breathe again. Rivers wound through the dust, and the winds that once carried only sand now carried the faint hum of returning life. The world was still harsh, still young and unsteady, but it was no longer silent. From the red plains to the shadowed marshes, new creatures were taking shape, leaner, quicker, and more deliberate than those that came before. Among them arose a lineage that would change the course of life on Earth forever. They were the archosaurs, a name that means ruling reptiles. At first, they did not look like rulers. Their bodies were small, their shapes unfamiliar, and their world still unstable. Yet hidden within their bones were innovations that would make them masters of nearly every domain the planet could offer. From their line would come crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, the future architects of land, sky, and sea. But in these early days, they were simply survivors with an edge. The heat of the Triassic was unforgiving. The air was thin, heavy with carbon, and the sun scorched the land with long, unbroken summers. For most creatures, the world demanded endurance just to exist. Yet the archosaurs did more than endure. They thrived. Their first secret was in their stance. Unlike the sprawling reptiles that crawled low to the ground, archosaurs held their legs directly beneath their bodies. This single shift changed everything. It allowed them to walk and run more efficiently, their steps longer and their bodies lifted above the hot earth. Each movement cost less energy. Each stride carried them farther. Some could even rise onto two legs, freeing their front limbs for balance or speed. In a world of predators and scarcity, this posture was the beginning of control. Inside them, another quiet revolution was taking place. Their lungs were built differently, more advanced, more efficient. Air moved through their bodies in a single direction, flowing continuously instead of in and out like a bellows. It meant they could draw more oxygen from every breath, even in an atmosphere where oxygen was scarce. Their hearts, too, were stronger, pumping blood with greater force, fueling muscles that could move swiftly, even in the stifling heat. These changes were invisible on the surface, yet they shaped everything the archosaurs would become. Their bodies were engines of endurance, built to travel far and fast, to chase and flee across a planet that offered no mercy. While other creatures rested through the hottest hours, the archosaurs moved. They hunted, migrated, and adapted, each generation pushing farther into the world's open spaces. Fossils show them in many forms. Some were small, darting through brush and along riverbanks, their limbs light and agile. Others grew taller, their tails acting as counterweights as they rose onto two legs. Some began to hint at the future shape of crocodiles, their jaws long and tooth-filled, their bodies streamlined for both land and water. Others bore the early outlines of the pterosaurs, slender bones, and light frames that would one day carry wings. What united them all was a kind of quiet innovation, a body that seemed to anticipate the challenges of a restless world. While older reptile lineages remained tied to slow rhythms of heat and rest, the archosaurs burned with energy. Their blood ran warmer, their hearts beat faster, and their movements hinted at something new, the potential for true dominance. Around them, the earth continued to change. Forests crept back along the coasts, insects filled the air with movement again. Amphibians clung to the wetlands, but they no longer ruled them. The reign of the sluggish was ending, replaced by creatures that moved with precision and purpose. Life was quickening its pace, and the archosaurs were leading the way. In the fossil beds of the Triassic, their bones are scattered like whispers of evolution's next idea. Here, a footprint pressed deep into the silt shows an animal walking upright. There, a jawbone reveals the beginnings of a new kind of bite, one designed not just to grasp, but to pierce. The marks they left behind tell of creatures that were not content to remain small. They were testing the boundaries of what a reptile could be, and as they spread across Pangia, their numbers grew. From the river valleys to the inland deserts, from humid coastal forests to mountain basins, they claimed territory once empty since the extinction. Each environment reshaped them a little differently, carving the paths that would one day diverge into crocodiles, dinosaurs, and the winged reptiles that would touch the sky. It was not conquest born of aggression, but of adaptability. The archosaurs were simply better suited to the new Earth, to its heat, its thin air, and its shifting rhythms. Where others faltered, they kept moving. Where others waited for the world to soften, they shaped their bodies to match it. In time, their diversity would become astonishing. Some would grow teeth like blades. Others would flatten their bodies for swimming or develop hollow bones for flight. Yet in this early moment, they were still bound by simplicity, lean, alert, and efficient, built to thrive in a world that punished weakness. The age of experiments was giving way to the age of refinement. The planet was still young, still uncertain, but the foundations of future empires were taking root in the bones of these small, determined reptiles. And so, in the lingering heat of the Triassic sun, the archosaurs began to walk the earth, upright, strong-hearted, and full of breath, carrying within them the blueprint for every great creature that would follow. The world, still trembling from its rebirth, had found its new rulers, not through strength alone, but through the quiet perfection of design. Far from the red deserts and sweltering plains of Pangaea, the oceans were slowly coming back to life. The same waters that had once turned green with death were beginning to shimmer blue again, clear enough for sunlight to reach through. Tiny plankton drifted with the currents, weaving the first threads of new food chains. Small fish darted among shadows. The sea, like the land, was waking from its long silence, but it was no longer the same ocean that had existed before the Great Dying. The ancient coral reefs were gone, the seafloor stripped bare. What lived here now was new, cautious, and searching for balance. And into this restless water came explorers from the shore, creatures that had once belonged to the land, but were now feeling the pull of the sea again. Among them were the nothosaurs, the first true sea reptiles. They were long and elegant, with slender necks, narrow skulls, and bodies shaped for gliding through the shallows. Their legs had transformed into broad paddles, strong enough to push through waves, yet flexible enough to crawl back onto the beaches where they laid their eggs. Their lives were caught between two worlds, but they moved through both with quiet grace. To picture a nothosaur is to imagine something between a lizard and a seal, with smooth skin and a tail that trailed behind like a ribbon. Fossils show that they reached lengths of several meters, yet they were light and built for movement, not for power. Their sharp teeth lined long jaws, perfect for catching slippery prey. They hunted by stealth, sliding beneath schools of fish before striking upward in a sudden blur of motion. The seas of the Triassic were places of constant change. Storms could turn calm waters, violent within moments, and the coastlines themselves shifted with the rising and falling of the continents. In this unpredictable world, nothosaurs became masters of adaptation. They could dive deep for food when needed, but they also relied on the warmth of the surface, rising often to breathe and to bask in the sun. Their bones tell the story of this double life. The limbs that once carried their ancestors across sand and stone had flattened into strong paddles, each finger elongated to push against the water. Yet their skeletons remained light, still echoing the frame of a land dweller. They were only beginning their journey into the sea, a first experiment in returning to the water that life had left behind hundreds of millions of years before. In the shallow lagoons that edged Pangia's coasts, nothosaurs would have glided silently, their shadows moving beneath the rippled light. Sometimes they gathered in small groups, perhaps drawn to the same fertile bays where prey was abundant. They hunted small fish, squid-like creatures, and the early crustaceans that scuttled across the sand. To escape larger predators, they could retreat to shore, pulling themselves awkwardly onto land, where their paddle limbs served them just well enough to drag their bodies over wet sand. But the ocean was changing quickly, and evolution was not content to stop with half measures. Over time, some descendants of nothosaurs began to dive deeper, staying in the water longer, their limbs growing more specialized for swimming. The shape of their bodies began to shift, the tail becoming more muscular, the legs less suited for land. Generation after generation, they drifted farther from the coasts, until one day they could no longer return. From these early swimmers would rise the ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards that would one day rule the Triassic seas. Their story had only just begun, but the foundation was here, in the quiet grace of their ancestors. Nothosaurs were the first to rediscover the sea's promise, the first to trust the water again after the planet's near extinction. The world they inhabited was still fragile. The air above was hot and thin, the land dry and scattered with salt flats. But beneath the surface, life was thriving in secret. Reefs were beginning to rebuild. New species of fish filled the currents, and tiny shells carpeted the ocean floor like seeds. The balance of the planet was slowly returning, and in that balance, the nothosaurs swam, both witness and architect of a new age. If one could drift beside them through the warm, shallow seas, the sight would have been strangely beautiful. Their long necks rose through the water like ribbons of silver. Their dark eyes caught the sunlight as they turned. Above them, the surface shimmered gold. Below them, faint forests of algae swayed with the tide. In this world of gentle motion, evolution was at work again, sculpting new forms from old bones. The nothosaurs were the first proof that life could move between worlds and find belonging in both. They carried the memory of land in their limbs and the promise of the ocean in their grace. And as the centuries turned to millennia, their descendants would push deeper, faster, farther, until the oceans themselves became their empire. But for now, in the calm shallows of the Triassic coast, the first sea reptiles drifted with the current, gliding through a planet still relearning how to live. The Earth, in its slow recovery, had reshaped itself into a world of extremes, where once there were forests and rivers that stretched without end. Now there were vast plains of rust-colored sand. The heart of Pangaea had become a desert so immense it could swallow entire continents of the modern world. Its dunes rose like sleeping giants, their shapes sculpted by the endless wind. From horizon to horizon, the land shimmered under the heat of the Triassic sun, a world painted in reds and golds, dry and hauntingly still. Here, rain was not a season but a miracle. Weeks, months, sometimes years would pass without a single drop. When at last the skies broke, the storms arrived suddenly and without mercy. Lightning cracked across the horizon, and sheets of water raced down ancient riverbeds, filling them for only a few brief days before they vanished again into the thirsty ground. The rivers came and went like ghosts, and every creature that lived here learned to move with their rhythm. The fossil record reveals the marks of this ancient dryness. The sandstones of the Triassic are cross-hatched with the traces of dunes that once towered hundreds of feet high. In places, the grains still carry the delicate ripples of wind that passed over them 200 million years ago. Salt flats spread across the lowlands, shimmering white under the glare of the sun. As the water evaporated, crystals grew like frost along the Earth's surface, glittering beneath the pale sky. It was a world that might seem lifeless to us now, but it was anything but still. In this furnace of heat and scarcity, life did what it always had. It adapted, quietly, ingeniously. Reptiles, in particular, flourished here. The dry air that suffocated amphibians and softer-skinned creatures posed no such threat to them. Their scales, layered like tiny shields, trapped moisture inside their bodies. Some grew thick armor across their backs to guard against both predators and the burning sun. Others evolved, lighter, smoother skin to reflect heat and allow quick bursts of speed across the open sands. Each was a small miracle of design, built to endure where few others could. During the cooler hours of dawn, the desert came alive. Small lizards crept from their burrows, their movements quick and precise. Insects stirred beneath the stones, leaving faint trails that vanished with the morning wind. Early reptiles, their bodies long and lean, waited near the edges of dry stream beds, hoping for the faintest trickle of water. When the sun climbed higher, the desert grew silent again, and everything that lived here disappeared into shade or soil, retreating from the heat that shimmered like fire above the ground. The air itself carried a strange beauty. Dust rose in slow spirals, glowing orange in the light. The horizon blurred with heat waves that danced and shifted, making distant shapes appear and vanish like mirages. The ground was patterned with cracks that stretched in every direction, forming mosaics that spoke of both drought and time. Even in this harshness, plants had begun to return. Hardy conifers stood scattered across the plains, their roots reaching deep to find the hidden veins of moisture beneath the surface. Small ferns grew where water lingered longest after the storms, their green fronds a delicate contrast against the red sand. These pockets of life were few but vital. Around them gathered the creatures of the desert, grazers, scavengers, and small predators who depended on each fragile oasis for survival. The Triassic sun was relentless, but it was also a giver. Its warmth drove winds that carried seeds across continents and powered storms that shaped the land. It baked the surface into stone, but also forged resilience into everything that endured its touch. The creatures of this world were no longer fragile survivors of catastrophe. They were innovators, each born of necessity, each crafted by the demands of a land that asked much and gave little. Footprints from this time still lie preserved in the ancient sandstone, the small, clawed impressions of reptiles moving in single file, their steps careful and deliberate. Some tracks end abruptly where the sand collapsed, perhaps the edge of a dried river. Others twist into looping paths, as if their makers wandered endlessly across the open expanse in search of shade or food. To stand before them now is to glimpse motion frozen in time, the quiet persistence of life etched into the bones of the earth itself. As the centuries turned to millennia, this desert world became a crucible of change. The heat and dryness forced evolution to sharpen its tools. Animals learned to live on little water, to hunt with precision, to hide in burrows where the air was cooler. Their bodies became more efficient, their senses more refined. Every heartbeat was a balance between survival and surrender. And so, in this vast planet of red deserts, life did not fade. It learned, it found rhythm in scarcity, harmony in struggle. The same sun that burned the land also gave it motion, and the same wind that scoured the dunes carried with it the seeds of future forests. It was an alien landscape, fierce and brilliant, where every living thing was both fragile and astonishingly strong. From the shifting sands of this world, new chapters of life were quietly taking shape, silent proof that even in the most desolate places, the story of Earth never truly stopped. Across the warming plains of the Triassic, when the air shimmered and the red deserts gave way to pockets of green, a new kind of predator prowled the land. It did not slither, and it did not bask in the sun like the reptiles that shared its world. Its movements were confident, its breath steady, its body alive with the inner warmth of its own making. It was called Cynognathus, and for a brief moment in time, it stood at the edge of a future that might have been very different. The name Cynognathus means dog jaw, and it fits. Imagine a creature about the size of a modern wolf, with a body built for speed and endurance. Its legs were held beneath its body rather than sprawling to the sides like a lizard's, allowing it to run with purpose across the open land. Its head was long and powerful, its jaws filled with sharp, varied teeth, some for cutting, some for grinding. This was no slow, lumbering reptile. It was an active hunter, warm-blooded and restless. Unlike most reptiles of its time, Cynognathus was likely covered in a light coat of fur, a thin insulation that trapped heat within its body. Its warm blood allowed it to move at dawn or dusk, to hunt when the world cooled and the cold-blooded hunters were still. It no longer depended on the sun to awaken its muscles. Its heart beat faster, its lungs drew air more efficiently, and its mind, small but alert, processed a changing world with sharper focus. In many ways, it was one of the first animals that felt familiar to us, not in form alone, but in behavior. Fossil evidence suggests that creatures like Cynognathus might have cared for their young, guarding their nests or dens from danger. Their bodies carried the first hints of what we would one day recognize as mammalian instincts: curiosity, awareness, and perhaps a spark of problem solving. They were no longer simply reacting to their surroundings, they were beginning to navigate them. Their world, however, was not gentle. The Triassic remained a landscape of extremes: scorching days, freezing nights, unpredictable rains. It was a world of new experiments where life tested every possible shape, strategy, and rhythm. Reptiles, archosaurs, and early dinosaurs were spreading across the land, each adapting in their own way. Yet for a time, Cynognathus and its kin were among the most successful of all. They hunted with efficiency and precision. Some chased small reptiles through the scrublands, using speed and endurance rather than ambush. Others scavenged the carcasses left by larger predators. Their teeth tell the story of versatility, a sign that they could eat many things and survive in many places. It was this adaptability that allowed them to thrive even as climates shifted and continents drifted apart. But evolution is not a story of fairness nor of destiny. It is a story of timing. As the Triassic wore on, the planet grew hotter and drier. Deserts expanded once again, pushing life toward the coasts and the rivers. The very traits that once gave Cynognathus an advantage, its warm blood, its need for food and water, its energy-hungry metabolism, became burdens. Reptiles, with their slower pace and greater tolerance for heat, began to spread where the mammals could not follow. The archosaurs, those rising rulers of the Triassic, took the lead. With their efficient lungs and upright stance, they could thrive in thin air and scorching heat. They did not tire easily, and they did not need to eat as often. Their eggs could survive in dry sand, while the softer bodied offspring of mammal like creatures required more care and shelter. Gradually, the balance of power shifted. Cynaegnathus, once the top hunter of its world, began to fade from dominance. Its descendants retreated into the shadows, shrinking in size, finding refuge in the cool nights and hidden burrows. While reptiles grew larger and more diverse, these warm-blooded survivors adapted to smaller roles: the quiet scavenger, the insect hunter, the night wanderer. Intelligence and endurance had carried them far, but the world itself had changed the rules. It is tempting to think of evolution as a contest of cleverness, that the sharpest mind or the fastest runner should always win. Yet nature does not measure worth in moments. It measures survival across millions of years, shaped by luck, weather, and the unspoken dialogue between life and its surroundings. In the Triassic, the mammals nearly took the stage early. They had warmth, awareness, and adaptability. But the world's climate favored those who could wait through the heat, who could slow their hearts and sleep through drought, who could live on less. Reptiles had patience written into their blood, and patience, in that time, was the greater gift. Still, Cynaegnathus left its mark. Its bones whisper of a near miss in the grand story of life, a glimpse of what could have been. Within its lineage lay the beginnings of fur, of milk, of the steady heartbeat that keeps warm-blooded life alive through night and cold. Though it did not rule the Triassic, its kind endured quietly beneath the feet of the giants that came after. And when those giants would one day fall, when the world shifted again and the balance turned once more, the descendants of Cynaegnathus would emerge from the shadows. For now, though, in this hot and restless age, it was the mammal that nearly won, a warm spark in a world still ruled by heat and bone. For so long, the land had worn the colors of rust and stone. Heat shimmered across the plains, and winds carved endless ripples into the red deserts of Pangia. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to soften. It began at the edges, where rivers curved like veins through the dust, where storms paused long enough to let the ground drink, where light met moisture and created something new. The first forests in tens of millions of years began to rise again. Their beginnings were humble, small, hardy shoots pressed through the soil, their roots clutching at sand and stone. They were the descendants of ancient survivors, plants that had endured the great collapse of life and waited in the quiet shadows for a gentler age. Now, as the world steadied, they began to reclaim their lost dominion. Conifers were among the first to return, their needles reaching upward in clusters that caught the sunlight like threads of green glass. They grew along the coasts and river valleys, where the air carried moisture from the sea. Their trunks, straight and narrow, stood as the first pillars of shade in a landscape long stripped bare. Beneath them, the air cooled. The soil darkened. Life began to gather. With the conifers came others, ginkgos, with their fan-shaped leaves fluttering like small golden sails, and cycads, with their thick stems and crown of feathery fronds. These plants were ancient lineages reborn, each adapted to endure both drought and flood. They grew in patient clusters along the floodplains, their roots binding the soil, their fallen leaves forming the first true mulch in an age that had forgotten the scent of decay. As the forests spread, so too did the rhythm of life around them. The wind no longer moved alone. It carried the hiss of leaves, the chirr of insects, the distant calls of creatures hidden beneath the shade. Where once the earth's heartbeat had been slow and heavy, it now began to quicken, steady and alive. Insects, long absent or reduced to scattered survivors, returned in dazzling variety. Beetles crept through the bark, polishing the wood with their small, iridescent bodies. Dragonflies hovered over still ponds, their wings flashing in the light like fragments of crystal. Their ancestors had lived through the collapse, but now they thrived, their new wings carrying them over rivers that glimmered with life. Early pollinators, delicate and tireless, visited the conifers and cycads, unwittingly weaving the threads of reproduction that would anchor the forests for ages to come. The biosphere was beginning to hum again. Fungi spread unseen beneath the soil, connecting roots in silent partnership. Mosses crept along fallen trunks, softening the edges of decay. Ferns returned in quiet waves, unfurling their spirals wherever light met moisture. Each layer of growth gave rise to another, building a network of green that wrapped itself around the earth like a healing bandage. The air itself began to change. The forests breathed out oxygen in abundance, and the thin atmosphere of the early Triassic grew richer, easier to fill the lungs of the creatures that walked beneath the trees. For the first time in ages, the air carried the scent of resin and living wood, of damp earth and sunlit needles. Along the forest floor, small reptiles scuttled between roots, their scales catching flecks of light that filtered through the canopy. Amphibians croaked in the cool pools that gathered after rain, their calls echoing through the trunks. The first small mammals, distant descendants of the resilient synapsids, ventured out at night, their soft fur brushing against leaves still wet from the dew. Everywhere, balance was being restored, not through grand gestures, but through small persistence. The forests cooled the air and gathered clouds. The clouds brought rain, and the rain fed rivers that carved the land into new shapes. The water carried nutrients back to the coasts, where the oceans, too, were recovering. The circle of life that had once collapsed into silence was turning once again. If one could walk through those early forests, the world would feel both alien and familiar. The conifers would tower overhead, their bark ridged and fragrant. The ginkgos would scatter golden leaves across the forest floor, their color bright against the dark soil. The cycads would rise in clusters, ancient and strange, their forms more like sculptures than trees. And through it all, the air would pulse with quiet motion, insects tracing invisible paths, breezes whispering through the branches, the faint hum of life rebuilding itself. The planet was no longer ruled by stillness, it was ruled by rhythm. The forests anchored that rhythm, drawing the scattered energy of Earth into a steady pulse once more. From this new green world, the next chapters of life would find their foundation. Creatures would adapt to the shade and the canopy, to the roots and rivers, to the air thickened with oxygen and the soil rich with decay. Every leaf, every wingbeat, every sound was a note in the planet's long song of recovery. And though these forests were unlike any that would follow, they carried within them the promise of all that would come after. A planet breathing again, quietly, beautifully, and alive. There came a time, long after the forests had returned, and the rivers had carved their way back through the heart of Pangia, when life dared to look upward. For hundreds of millions of years, the air above the earth had belonged only to the wind, to drifting spores, and to insects gliding on fragile wings. But now, a new kind of creature was about to take that open space for its own. The first true flyers had arrived, the pterosaurs. Their beginnings were quiet, almost hidden among the branches and cliffs that bordered the Triassic seas. They were small at first, no larger than a raven, with long, delicate wings that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Their bones were thin, nearly hollow, yet strong enough to withstand the pull of the wind. Within their chests, powerful muscles attached to broad breastbones that could lift them into the air, and on each hand, one finger had grown impossibly long, a living framework that stretched the skin of the wing into a perfect, graceful curve. From this design came the first vertebrate capable of true flight. To watch them must have been extraordinary. At dawn, when the air was cool and the sun turned the horizon gold, they would launch from cliffs or tall trees, catching the breeze with a flutter of leathery wings. Their silhouettes drifted across the water, circling the edges of rivers where insects and small fish gathered. Some glided effortlessly, letting the currents carry them. Others flapped with quick precision, darting and diving like arrows. They were not just moving through the air, they were learning to master it. Their wings were unlike any that would follow. Birds, which would come much later, would evolve feathers and rigid structure, but the pterosaur's wings were living sails of skin and muscle, supported by that one impossibly long finger. They were flexible, capable of folding tight against the body or spreading wide to ride the thermals rising from the land. Each curve and fold adjusted in flight, letting them twist and turn with a dancer's control. To stay aloft in such a thin atmosphere demanded efficiency. The Triassic air still held less oxygen than today's, yet these creatures had found ways to make every breath count. Their bones were light and hollow, filled with air sacs that both reduced their weight and fueled their lungs. Their hearts beat fast, and their bodies burned energy at a rate unknown in any reptile before them. They were creatures of speed and metabolism. Their lives lived quickly, their moments filled with motion. Fossils reveal traces of their fine hair-like coverings, called pycnofibers, soft insulation that kept their warm bodies from losing heat during flight. Though not quite feathers, they were a sign of something new stirring in evolution: warmth, constant motion, and independence from the cold-blooded rhythm of the sun. The pterosaurs were the first of the reptiles to truly escape the boundaries of the ground and the sea. Below them, the world was still changing. Forests spread across the coastlines, insects swarmed over flowers yet to fully evolve, and rivers glistened beneath the hot, heavy air. The skies above this world were often streaked with clouds of red dust from the deserts, but the pterosaurs moved through it with ease, tracing paths that no creature had ever followed before. Their diets were as varied as their forms. Some skimmed the surface of the sea, their jaws slicing through the water to snatch small fish. Others hunted inland, catching dragonflies or small reptiles on the wing. Their teeth, when they had them, were fine and pointed, perfect for gripping slippery prey. Yet some early species bore no teeth at all, relying instead on speed and precision to secure their meals. And in their bones, scientists have found signs of growth so rapid that they likely reached adulthood within a single year. Life, for them, was fleeting but full, a cycle of constant motion, of flight at dawn and rest at dusk, repeated across the endless expanse of Triassic skies. The pterosaurs were not just survivors of a harsh world, they were inventors. They redefined what was possible. With their light frames and hollow bones, they explored a realm that had never known vertebrate life before. They soared above predators and floods, above the shifting dunes and the restless coasts, finding freedom where others found limits. Imagine standing on a Triassic shoreline, the waves slow and heavy, the air thick with heat. Above you, shapes pass against the sun, their wings wide and silent, their shadows gliding over the ground. For a moment, the planet itself seems to hold its breath, watching as life takes its first steady flight. The sky had always been there, waiting, vast, untamed, and open. Now, for the first time, it belonged to living things. With the rise of the pterosaurs, Earth had conquered its third domain. The seas had their hunters, the land its wanderers, and now the air was alive with movement. The rhythm of the planet had grown more complex, more complete, and though the world below still carried the scars of fire and extinction, the heavens above had begun to fill with grace, with wings that turned sunlight into motion and silence into song. The age of flight had begun. Beneath the surface of the Triassic seas, where sunlight faded into green haze and the water pulsed with quiet rhythm, a new shape of life began to glide. It was sleek, fast, and impossibly graceful, a creature that seemed almost designed by the sea itself. These were the ichthyosaurs, the ocean hunters, and they marked the moment when reptiles truly claimed the water as their own. The first of their kind had once walked on land. Their ancestors were not born swimmers, but wanderers who had followed rivers to the coast and then slipped, generation by generation, into deeper waters. The transformation was gradual but profound. Legs stretched into paddles, tails grew stronger, bending into a crescent that could slice through waves. Lungs became more efficient, allowing longer dives. Each change carried them farther from the shore until the land became nothing more than a memory written into their bones. By the height of the Triassic, the ichthyosaurs had perfected the art of life at sea. Their bodies had grown streamlined and powerful, shaped like the dolphins that would one day echo their form. Their skin was smooth, their movements effortless. They swam not with the twisting undulations of lizards, but with the steady, rhythmic motion of a tail built for propulsion. Each stroke sent them gliding forward like living arrows, silent and swift. Their eyes were enormous, the largest ever known in any animal, perfectly adapted for the dim blue twilight of the deep. With them, they could see the faintest flicker of motion far below, the shimmer of a fish, or the movement of something larger. In the cold darkness, sight was everything, and theirs was a world painted in shifting shades of light and shadow. Unlike their ancestors, the ichthyosaurs no longer returned to land. The sea was their cradle, their hunting ground, their only home. They gave birth to live young in the open ocean, a breathtaking adaptation that freed them forever from the need to crawl ashore. Fossil skeletons show mothers preserved in the moment of birth, tiny ichthyosaurs emerging headfirst into the water, already perfect little swimmers. The ocean had claimed them completely, and with their arrival, the balance of the sea changed. Before them, life beneath the waves had been rebuilding slowly, piecing itself together from what remained after the great extinction. Fish and invertebrates filled the shallows, but the open waters had lacked true rulers. The ichthyosaurs filled that space with precision. Their teeth, fine and conical, were perfect tools for catching slippery prey. They hunted schools of fish, cephalopods, and anything else that moved through their reach. Some species grew slender and fast, chasing their quarry in bursts of speed. Others became larger, heavier, with jaws that could crush the armor of ammonites or bite through the bodies of smaller marine reptiles. Each generation refined the ocean's design, reshaping the web of life. Smaller hunters followed, the ichthyosaurs scavenging what they left behind. Prey species adapted in turn, growing faster, forming schools, developing defenses of shell or speed. What had once been an empty sea became alive again with tension and rhythm, predator and prey locked together in the same endless dance. Fossil evidence tells of vast diversity within their ranks. Some ichthyosaurs were no longer than a person's arm, darting through coral shallows. Others grew to lengths of 15 meters, sleek giants gliding through open waters with slow confidence. The ocean had become their kingdom, and within its boundaries, they filled every possible role, from ambushers to long-distance travelers, from hunters of the surface to divers of the deep. The surface world had its own struggles, deserts shifting, forests expanding, and reptiles conquering the skies. But beneath the waves, a quieter transformation was taking place. The ichthyosaurs were not loud conquerors. They ruled by elegance, by balance, by adapting so completely that they became one with the water around them. Their bodies carried no waste, no excess, only purpose. Imagine standing on a Triassic shore and looking out over the waves. The ocean seems still, but beneath the reflection of the sun, life moves with precision and grace. Schools of small fish scatter as shadows pass above them. The light fades quickly into blue, then into darkness, where enormous eyes catch faint glimmers from below. There, in the calm of the deep, an ichthyosaur glides past, silent, sleek, its skin marked with the faint lines of muscle that ripple as it swims. It exhales a stream of bubbles, rises for air, then vanishes again into the depths. This was the ocean's renewal. The ichthyosaurs had taken what was once an emptiness and turned it into an ecosystem alive with motion and connection. They had reinvented the marine world from scratch, proving that even after near total extinction, life could not only return, but evolve into something entirely new. For millions of years, they would dominate the seas, evolving into countless forms before giving way to other rulers. But here, in the Triassic, they were at their height, the first true masters of the ocean's vastness. They were not creatures of destruction or chaos, but of restoration. In their rise, the Earth's waters learned again how to move, how to hunt, how to live. And in the stillness of those deep blue realms, the planet found a rhythm it had almost forgotten, the steady pulse of life returning to the sea. By the middle of the Triassic, the world had found a rhythm again. Forests whispered along the coasts, rivers cut through valleys rich with life, and the seas glimmered with the movement of swift, shining hunters. But above all this quiet renewal, one great pattern had taken shape. The age of reptiles had truly begun. From the smallest stream to the driest plain, every corner of the earth seemed to echo with their presence. The archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, had become the architects of life's new order. They were not one kind of creature, but many, each shaped by the land it called home. Some crept, some ran, some glided above the trees, others waited, patient and still, for the perfect moment to strike. They were everywhere, and in them, evolution had found its most versatile design. The first great rulers of this age were not the dinosaurs, at least not yet. They were the early relatives of crocodiles, powerful creatures that looked unlike the low, slow reptiles we know today. These ancient cousins walked upright, their legs positioned directly beneath their bodies, lifting their bellies high above the ground. Their steps were confident, their spines straight, their motion smooth and deliberate. This posture gave them both endurance and strength. They could walk long distances, chase prey across open land, or stand still for hours, waiting in perfect silence. Their forms varied wildly. Some were small, quick-footed hunters no longer than a person's arm, darting between the roots of conifers and cycads. Others were heavy-bodied predators, their jaws lined with teeth that gleamed in the sun. In the river valleys of ancient Pangia, some even returned to the water, their limbs flattening once more into paddles, their tails growing thick and powerful for swimming. It was as though evolution were painting the same idea in 100 different ways, testing which shapes worked best for a world still in flux. The land they ruled was unpredictable, hot, restless, and scattered with extremes. Floods and droughts came and went in rhythm with shifting climates. To survive here required flexibility, and that was the gift of the archosaurs. They were creatures built for endurance. Their lungs could draw oxygen more efficiently than those of their rivals. Their hearts, divided into chambers, pumped blood with power and precision. They could live where the air was thin, where the heat was unbearable, where food came and went with the seasons. Every ecosystem now had one of them at its core. In the rivers, armored crocodile-kin hunted the amphibians and fish that dared the shallows. On the plains, slender archosaurs with long limbs and sharp eyes stalked small prey through the grasses and ferns. Even in the forests, where shade softened the heat, lighter species moved gracefully through the undergrowth, quick as shadows. The earth was filling with reptiles of every size and purpose, a living tapestry of scales and motion. And within this vast family of creatures, a smaller branch was beginning to take shape, one that would someday change everything. The early dinosaurs were still minor players in this Triassic world. They were small, nimble, and not yet the towering giants they would one day become. Their bones were hollow, their movements light. They ran on two legs, their bodies balanced by long, slender tails. They hunted insects, small reptiles, and anything they could outrun. To larger predators, they were little more than prey, yet their design carried something new, a restless energy that set them apart. Fossils of creatures like Eoraptor and Calophysis show their growing potential. These early dinosaurs moved with grace and speed, their bones built for agility rather than brute strength. They were warm-blooded in a world that still depended on the sun. Their hearts and lungs, descendants of the archosaurs' perfected machinery, powered them through long hunts and fast escapes. While the great crocodile-like rulers commanded the swamps and riverbanks, the dinosaurs found opportunity in the open land, learning to thrive in spaces their larger kin overlooked. The two lineages, crocodile relatives and early dinosaurs, shared a distant ancestor, yet they had diverged into separate paths. One ruled through patience and armor, the other through movement and adaptability. Together, they defined the Triassic, one shaping the still waters, the other testing the wind and the earth. To stand in that world would have been to witness a planet alive with motion and invention. Herds of plant-eating reptiles wandered across the low plains, their feet kicking up red dust that shimmered in the light. In the distance, upright predators watched them, silent and still, until the moment came to strike. Near the rivers, smaller creatures moved in and out of the water, their scales glistening with droplets of sunlight. Overhead, pterosaurs wheeled in the sky, tracing arcs across clouds that glowed with the color of sand and heat. It was a time of balance, though it had come through struggle. The archosaurs had learned to rule not through dominance alone, but through adaptation. The same traits that had once helped their ancestors survive catastrophe now allowed them to master every part of the planet, and while many of their forms would fade with time, their legacy would not. In their veins, evolution carried the blueprints of flight, of endurance, of grace and power. From them, new empires of life would rise, yet in this moment, the Triassic belonged entirely to them. The earth, once silent and scarred, now pulsed with the steady rhythm of scales and heartbeats. In the reign of the archosaurs, life had found its confidence again, strong, unyielding, and endlessly inventive beneath the burning Triassic sun. In the fading heat of the Triassic sun, when the air shimmered over the plains and the archosaurs ruled every stretch of land and water, something quiet and extraordinary began to unfold. It was not marked by thunder or flame, but by the sound of small, quick footsteps pattering over the red earth. The first dinosaurs had arrived. They were not giants, not yet. They did not tower over the landscape or roar across the plains. They were slender, alert, and graceful, creatures of light and speed. Fossils like Eoraptor and Calophysis reveal the outlines of this beginning. They were about the height of a human knee, with long tails, sharp eyes, and bones so delicate they seemed almost hollow. Yet within those fragile forms burned a new kind of energy, something the earth had never seen before. Their ancestors, the early archosaurs, had already rewritten the rules of life on land. But the dinosaurs went further. They moved with a rhythm unlike anything else in their world. Their spines were balanced for agility. Their legs held straight beneath their bodies for endurance, their muscles wound tight like coiled springs. Every part of them spoke of movement, quick, precise, unstoppable. When they ran, their tails stretched behind them as counterweights, steadying their speed. When they stopped, their heads turned sharply, scanning their surroundings with the focus of hunters and survivors alike. These were creatures designed not for waiting, but for acting. Their bones tell stories of lightness. Inside, the marrow cavities were wide and filled with air sacs, making their skeletons strong yet nearly weightless. This gave them the freedom to move in ways that older reptiles could not, to sprint, leap, and twist through the brush. The air sacs may also have helped them breathe more efficiently, a feature that would one day let their descendants grow into the largest animals to ever walk the earth. But here, in these early forms, that same design made them swift and tireless in the heat of the Triassic day. Unlike their cold-blooded ancestors, these small dinosaurs carried the fire of their own warmth within them. Their bodies burned energy fast, feeding hearts that beat quickly and lungs that filled with air like bellows. They could hunt at dawn or dusk when the reptiles around them were sluggish with chill. This inner heat was a revolution, a new rhythm of life that broke free from the limits of temperature and sun. Eoraptor, one of the earliest known dinosaurs, lived in what is now Argentina. Its name means dawn thief, a fitting title for the small, agile predator it was. With a body less than a meter long, it darted through the undergrowth, snapping at insects and small vertebrates. Its hands were built for grasping, its teeth for tearing. It was quick, clever, and endlessly alert. Far to the north, in the floodplains of what would become North America, Coelophysis emerged, slender, long-necked, and built for speed. Herds of these animals may have gathered near riverbanks, their narrow heads glinting in the light as they hunted in groups. They were social, perhaps even cooperative, their movements synchronized like dancers across the open land. In their fossil beds, dozens of individuals lie together, a frozen echo of their shared lives. The world they moved through was both harsh and full of promise. The forests were sparse but spreading. The rivers were shallow and unpredictable, carving patterns through red soil. Giant reptiles ruled the waterways and the lowlands, but the small dinosaurs found their freedom in motion. They lived where the larger predators could not go, slipping between trees and over rocky slopes, adapting to every crack in the Earth's new design. Their evolution was quiet, almost unnoticed, yet the consequences would be profound. In their quick steps and warm blood, the future of life on land was being written. They carried within them the blueprints of speed, intelligence, and endurance, traits that would one day lift them to dominance and give rise to creatures of unimaginable size and grace. But for now, they were simply survivors in a restless age. They watched the world with sharp, intelligent eyes, hunted with precision, and laid their eggs in the warmth of the sand. They were light enough to move quickly, strong enough to defend themselves, and clever enough to endure. In a landscape of towering archosaurs and massive predators, their smallness was not a weakness, but a strength. Fossils of their footprints can still be found pressed into ancient riverbeds, a trail of delicate, three-toed impressions crossing mud that hardened into stone. Each print is a heartbeat from that long-lost age, a moment when the first dinosaurs passed through and vanished, leaving only silence behind. No one in that Triassic world could have known what those tracks would mean. The creatures that ruled then, the crocodile-like hunters, the sail-backed reptiles, the winged pterosaurs, all seemed destined to last forever. Yet history, like life, is patient. It unfolds in whispers before it roars. And so, the first dinosaurs walked lightly across their fragile world, unaware that they carried the future within them. Their time had not yet come, but it was approaching, carried on swift legs and beating hearts, beneath skies that were beginning to cool, across a planet learning to live again. In their fragile bones and steady steps, the Earth was testing an idea, one that would one day fill the continents with giants and wings, with roars and songs. But here, in the quiet light of the Triassic, it began softly, with creatures small enough to vanish into the grass, yet strong enough to shape the world forever. High above the forests and rivers of the Triassic, the air shimmered with warmth. Winds carried dust from the red deserts across the land, and rising thermals twisted upward into the open sky. It was a world alive with heat and motion, and into this world, life had begun to master the unseen, the thin, invisible ocean above the ground. Flight, that miracle of motion, did not begin with feathers or wings alone. Long before the sky filled with gliding shapes, it began with something far quieter, the breath within. Reptiles had long ruled the land, but some among them carried secrets within their bodies that would one day reshape life itself. Deep inside their chests, the structure of their lungs was changing. Instead of the simple inflating sacs that filled and emptied like a bellows, these creatures evolved something extraordinary, air that moved through them in a single direction, flowing constantly over delicate networks of blood vessels. This was the birth of the flow-through lung, a design so efficient that every breath captured almost all the oxygen it could. It was a transformation not visible from the outside, yet it was as profound as any leap in form or limb. These new lungs did not merely take in air, they used it completely. Fresh oxygen flowed in one side and out the other, never mixing with stale air. Every inhale and exhale became part of a continuous rhythm, fueling muscles that could move longer, faster, and with greater endurance. In time, small air sacs branched off from the lungs, spreading into the bones themselves. These hollow spaces lightened the skeleton, allowing the body to grow without becoming heavy. They also acted as reservoirs of breath, ensuring that air continued to flow even when the creature exhaled. With each heartbeat, oxygen moved swiftly through the blood, feeding energy to every muscle fiber. From this hidden architecture, the first pterosaurs rose into the sky. Their wings, stretched between elongated fingers, caught the air and turned it into lift. But it was their lungs and hearts, not just their limbs, that made sustained flight possible. A body could not remain aloft on structure alone. It needed the power to feed the fire within. Their hearts, too, had evolved to match this rhythm. Evidence from bone and fossilized cavities suggests that these early flyers had developed the first signs of a divided heart, a muscular wall that kept oxygen-rich blood separate from oxygen-poor blood. Each beat sent fresh energy coursing through the body, keeping the wings strong and steady. It was not merely strength that allowed them to fly, but balance, the harmony of breath and blood, of lightness and power. Each wing beat was a conversation between air and life, a perfect exchange of energy that began deep inside the chest. Flight, in its truest form, is not a battle against gravity. It is a partnership with air, an understanding of how to move through it without resistance, how to borrow its strength and return it as motion. The reptiles who achieved this were not the largest or fiercest of their kind. They were those who learned to breathe differently. Imagine one of these early pterosaurs gliding above a Triassic coastline. Its wings catch the sunlight, tracing long arcs across the water below. The air flows through its lungs without pause, its heart keeping time like a quiet drum. It banks gently, turning into the wind, its bones hollow yet unyielding. Beneath it, the forests sway and the rivers glimmer like mirrors. It is not flying in defiance of the world, it is moving as part of it, carried by the same currents that stir the trees and shape the clouds. In that same age, other reptiles on land shared fragments of this design. The archosaurs, ancestors of crocodiles and dinosaurs, also carried lungs that drew air with unusual efficiency. In them, the seeds of a future lineage were forming, creatures that would one day grow feathers, flap through storms, and sing to the morning light. The blueprint for birds was already alive, written in the structure of their breath. To sustain flight, an animal must carry the sky within itself. Each breath must do more than keep it alive, it must give it power. The air sacs and flow through lungs of these ancient reptiles were not inventions of flight, but its foundation. They taught the body how to be light, how to endure, how to burn energy with grace. This invisible evolution of lungs, of hearts, of circulation was one of the great silent revolutions of the Triassic. It changed what life could do with air. It made motion more efficient, endurance more lasting, and the boundaries of the world wider than ever before. And so, long before feathers brushed the wind, before song filled the sky, the architects of flight were already at work, crafting wings not from bone or muscle, but from breath itself. Every wing beat that followed, from the leathery sails of the pterosaurs to the feathers of the first true birds, carried the same ancient rhythm. The rhythm of air flowing through lungs, of hearts that learned to divide and beat stronger, of creatures that took a single breath and turned it into freedom. Flight, in the end, began not with the sky, but with breath. It was not the shape of wings that made life rise, but the quiet perfection of lungs that never stopped moving, the same breath that, even now, keeps the world alive. The forests of the late Triassic were warm and restless, their edges broken by rivers that shimmered under a red sun. The air carried the weight of humidity and the scent of resin from conifers that swayed in the heat. It was a time of balance, fragile but fierce, when life had grown bold again after ages of rebuilding. Every valley, plain, and marsh echoed with the sound of motion. Herds grazed, wings beat softly overhead. The world had filled once more with rhythm, and into that rhythm stepped giants. Among the trees moved creatures that looked like something between a crocodile and a dinosaur. Their jaws were long, lined with teeth like daggers. Their bodies were heavy, their scales thick as armor. But unlike their ancient, sprawling ancestors, these predators walked tall, their legs held beneath them, their stride strong and deliberate. They were called Postosuchus, and they were among the greatest hunters of their time. Fossils of Postosuchus tell the story of a creature built for dominance. It stood nearly 3 meters long, its skull large and deep, its teeth serrated and curved for tearing flesh. Its eyes faced forward, giving it the sharp vision of a stalker. Yet the most striking thing about it was its posture. Unlike crocodiles today, which crawl low and slow, Postosuchus walked upright, lifting its body high above the ground. With long hind limbs and shorter forelimbs, it could move with surprising speed. Some evidence even suggests it could rear up onto 2 legs for short bursts, running down prey with terrifying precision. In the late Triassic, few creatures could challenge such power. Postosuchus was the apex predator of its age, ruling the river valleys and floodplains of Pangia. It hunted the great herbivores of the time, bulky, tusked reptiles and early dinosaurs that moved in cautious herds. Every mark in the fossil record, every tooth found embedded in bone, speaks of a world caught in its first great arms race between hunter and hunted. Prey were changing too. They were growing faster, learning to sense danger through vibration and scent. Many developed new defenses, thicker skin, keener eyes, quicker reflexes. Some relied on numbers, finding safety in herds that could scatter and confuse their attackers. Others learned stillness, freezing in the shadows until the danger passed. But for each adaptation that gave prey a chance, evolution sharpened the hunter in turn. The rise of Pastosuchus marked a turning point in the story of life. No longer was survival only a matter of endurance. Now it required strategy. The world had entered an age of competition where every movement could mean life or death, and every species learned from the one that pursued or fled from it. Imagine one of these predators at dusk. The air cools as the sun sinks low, painting the horizon in crimson and gold. Shadows stretch across the forest floor. The faint sound of footsteps breaks the silence, slow, deliberate, patient. A herd of small dinosaurs grazes nearby, their long necks lifting in unison as they sense something watching. The hunter waits, half hidden among the trunks. Its nostrils flare, catching the faint scent of life on the wind. Then, in a single breath, it moves. When Postosuchus struck, it did not chase recklessly. It lunged with purpose. Its claws tore into soil as it closed the distance, its jaws snapping shut around muscle and bone. The struggle was brief, the silence afterward heavy. Nature's balance was kept not through peace, but through perfect tension, predator and prey, each driving the other to adapt, to evolve, to refine the art of survival. The ecosystems of the Triassic had grown complex. Rivers supported amphibians and fish. Forests held small reptiles and the early mammals that hid in burrows and shadows. Overhead, pterosaurs drifted in slow circles, searching for the remains left by larger hunters. Even insects joined the pattern, feasting on carcasses that fed the soil, which in turn gave life back to the forests. Every creature played a role in the great cycle of renewal, but at its center stood the predators, shaping the balance through fear and motion. Postosuchus was not alone in its reign. Across the continents of Pangia, other great hunters evolved with similar designs. Some were smaller but swifter, built for ambush rather than endurance. Others grew larger, their jaws wide enough to crush the bones of their prey. These creatures were not dinosaurs, though they shared many of the same strengths. They were the cousins of the dinosaurs, part of the wider Archosaur family, the same lineage that would one day give rise to both the reptiles that stalked the swamps and the birds that soared above them. Yet their time would not last forever. The Earth was still changing, its climates unpredictable, its continents drifting apart. But for now, in this age of heat and dust, the predators thrived. They ruled not only through strength, but through mastery, of quarry, movement, of patience, of precision. In the twilight of the Triassic, the land itself seemed to breathe with their presence. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple on the water carried the memory of the hunt. The world had grown bold again, confident in its own vitality, and beneath the great red sky, the Earth's new kings walked tall, their shadows long across the plains, as the first true balance of predator and prey unfolded across a living, restless planet. By the late Triassic, the Earth had grown busy with motion. Predators like Pastosuchus stalked the river valleys. Pterosaurs glided above the forests. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of conifers, and the land pulsed with new life. Yet amid the chaos of hunters and shifting climates, another kind of creature was quietly taking a different path, one not built on speed or stealth, but on size. From the floodplains of Pangaea rose the first of the great herbivorous dinosaurs, and their answer to the danger around them was simple: grow larger than anything else. Among these early giants was Plateosaurus, one of the first great plant eaters to dominate the land. Its fossils, scattered across ancient Europe, tell the story of a creature that could reach up to 10 meters in length. It stood on two powerful legs, with a long neck stretching forward and a thick tail trailing behind for balance. Its forelimbs, though smaller, were strong enough to pull branches within reach or to steady its body as it moved through the forests and open plains. In a world of small, nimble dinosaurs and swift predators, Plateosaurus represented something entirely new, the first true experiment in becoming a giant. Its bones reveal how evolution was beginning to play with the limits of scale. Each vertebra was hollowed to save weight while maintaining strength. Its limbs were built like pillars, sturdy and efficient, carrying its great mass with surprising grace. When it moved, the ground trembled softly beneath its steps, and its shadow stretched long across the Triassic sun. Plateosaurus was not a creature of aggression, nor of fear. Its power came from presence. Few predators dared to test such bulk, and even fewer succeeded. Its sheer size was protection, a living fortress of bone and muscle. Yet this growth was not without cost. The body of a giant required constant feeding. To sustain itself, Plateosaurus would have spent much of its life eating, stripping leaves from trees, grazing on low shrubs, and moving from forest to forest in search of more. Its teeth, shaped like simple blades, were not meant for chewing but for slicing. Food was swallowed in great mouthfuls, passing into a vast gut where fermentation and time did the work that teeth could not. Inside that long body, chemistry replaced speed. It was a slower rhythm of life, one that favored endurance over agility, patience over reaction. This new strategy, survival through size, marked a turning point in evolution. The Triassic world was unpredictable, its weather fierce, its predators relentless. For smaller creatures, life depended on quickness and cleverness. For the giants, survival became a matter of sheer mass. A predator might chase a smaller meal, but it would think twice before attacking something that could crush it beneath a single step. In this balance of fear and restraint, the herbivores began to rule by quiet dominance. The landscape itself shaped them. Forests grew taller and denser, their leaves rising beyond the reach of smaller grazers. Long necks evolved to bridge the distance between earth and canopy. Bodies lengthened to hold the machinery of digestion. Slowly, over countless generations, the first blueprints of the sauropods, the largest animals ever to walk the earth, began to take shape. Though Plateosaurus was not yet a sauropod, it carried the beginnings of that legacy within its frame. The long neck, the columnar limbs, the deep chest, all were hints of what was to come. In its massive body lay the first whispers of future titans like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, whose descendants would one day stretch across continents and reshape the Earth's ecosystems entirely. But here, in the Triassic, the experiment was still young. The world was a patchwork of forests and dry basins, rivers that flooded and vanished, climates that swung between extremes. To survive here required resilience. The Plateosaurus did not just live in this world, it endured. Its body, vast and slow, became a symbol of patience against change. Imagine one of these giants standing at the edge of a Triassic floodplain. The air hums with heat, its neck rises above the ferns, its head turning slowly toward a grove of ginkgos. The ground beneath it is patterned with the prints of smaller creatures that scatter at its approach. It moves forward, steady and unhurried, its tail sweeping gently through the air. In its wake, the dust settles back to silence. Around it, life continues in miniature, insects buzzing near pools of water, small reptiles darting between roots, and distant predators watching from the shadows. Yet none interfere. The Plateosaurus belongs to a different scale of existence, one beyond competition. It consumes what the land gives, then moves on, leaving behind the marks of its feet and the slow renewal of the plants it prunes. This was the beginning of a new kind of balance, not driven by the hunt, but by the weight of being. The great herbivores shaped the land through movement and hunger, spreading seeds, clearing paths, and changing the flow of vegetation across the Triassic plains. Every forest they passed through grew differently afterward. Every ecosystem bent quietly around their presence. The rise of the Plateosaurus marked the moment when the Earth first learned what it meant to carry giants. It was not power for the sake of domination, but power as endurance, as adaptation, as quiet permanence in a world that still trembled with change. In the slow steps of these early giants, the planet discovered a new rhythm, the rhythm of size, of patience, of life too large to rush. The age of the small and swift was giving way to something greater, something that would soon reshape the Earth's horizons. And as the Triassic sun sank across the endless plains, the shadow of Plateosaurus stretched over the land like a promise that life, when given time, will always find new ways to rise. The world never truly stands still. Beneath the forests, beneath the deserts, beneath the quiet plains where the first great dinosaurs wandered, the earth was stirring. Deep inside, molten rock moved like a slow tide, reshaping the surface above it. The Triassic world was not fixed in place. It was alive, restless, and slowly tearing itself apart. Once, the continents of the earth had been joined together as one, a single vast supercontinent that scientists call Pangia. It stretched from the frozen poles to the equator's burning heart, a landmass so enormous that the air above its center rarely saw the sea. Its edges met wide oceans that shimmered in sunlight, while its interior baked under a sun that rose red and set in dust. But now, cracks were beginning to open in that ancient union. The land itself began to split, quietly at first. Beneath the crust, rivers of magma pressed upward, heating the rock until it softened and pulled apart. Great rifts spread like scars across the landscape, filling with lakes and volcanoes. Over millions of years, those narrow valleys deepened into trenches, and those trenches became seas. Pangaea, once a single skin of land, began to divide into pieces, the earliest outlines of the continents we know today. As the continents drifted, the world's face changed. Mountain ranges rose along the lines where land masses collided. Valleys sank where the crust stretched thin. New coastlines appeared, their beaches glowing under the light of alien stars, their waves washing over rocks that had never known the ocean before. The air itself began to shift. Winds that once blew unbroken across a single supercontinent now tangled with the patterns of ocean and land. Rain fell where it had never fallen before, feeding new forests along the edges of the rift valleys. Deserts that once lay silent began to bloom for the first time in ages, their dry plains broken by rivers that flowed toward the sea. The climate grew more complex, more alive. The old rhythm of endless heat gave way to a patchwork of change. In one place, humid jungles steamed with life. In another, cool breezes swept through mountain passes where snow would one day fall. The earth was learning variation, and with it, evolution found new tools to work with. Isolation became one of life's greatest teachers. When the continents drifted apart, so too did their living inhabitants. Populations that once shared the same valleys found themselves separated by mountains, deserts, or seas. Cut off from one another, they began to change in different ways. Tiny differences, at first, a shift in bone shape, a pattern in the skin, a lengthening of limb or tooth. But over time, these differences deepened into diversity. Each new environment asked different questions, and evolution answered in many voices. In wetter regions, reptiles adapted to thick vegetation, growing long necks to reach leaves above the ferns. In drier places, smaller creatures developed speed and lightness, darting between shadows in the heat. Along the forming coastlines, New species returned to the water, their bodies reshaped by the rhythm of tides and waves. It was as if life itself was testing the possibilities of a divided world. What had once been one ecosystem now became many. In the north, vast river deltas filled with amphibians and early dinosaurs. In the south, open plains stretched beneath endless skies, where herds of herbivores moved like living shadows across the dust. Between them, new predators evolved, some sleek and fast, others massive and patient. The continents drifted only a few centimeters each year, but time was generous. Over millions of years, those centimeters became oceans. Creatures that had once been neighbors became strangers, yet in their separation, life grew richer. Each fragment of Pangaea became a laboratory of evolution, shaping forms that would one day populate every corner of the earth. The slow motion of the continents also changed the seas. Ocean currents shifted, carrying warmth to new latitudes and stirring up nutrients that fed marine life. Coral reefs began to form again, painting the shallows in color. The waters teemed with ammonites and fish, while above them, the first marine reptiles cut through the waves with sleek precision. The ocean, once suffocated by the great dying, was alive again, reborn by motion. From the sky, the planet would have looked familiar and strange all at once. The cracks of rift valleys glowed faintly with the light of volcanoes. The blue of the seas deepened as new coasts unfolded. Clouds gathered over fresh mountains, spilling rain onto newborn forests. The earth was no longer a single, still body but a collection of living parts, drifting apart and remaking themselves endlessly. This motion would never stop. The continents would continue to drift and collide, opening and closing oceans, shaping climates, creating new homes for life. Even today, the ground beneath us still moves, with that same ancient rhythm. But in the Triassic, it was all new. The first great rearrangement after the world's near ending, the beginning of the planet we now know. In this shifting world, every creature was a traveler, carried by a planet that refused to rest. Mountains would rise and vanish, oceans would open and close, and life, ever patient, would follow the motion, adapting to each new landscape it was given. The earth had begun to move again, not as a wound, but as a promise, a quiet assurance that creation was not finished, that even the ground beneath our feet is part of life's endless unfolding. The continents drifted apart like slow breaths, and in that motion, the story of every future world began. The Triassic world, once silent and scarred, had found its voice again. After ages of recovery and rebirth, the land was no longer a place of only survival. It was a place of expression. The creatures that filled its forests, rivers, and skies were no longer defined only by shape and strength. They had begun to glow, to sing, and to communicate in ways unseen before. It is easy to imagine prehistory as muted, a world of grays and browns beneath a pale sky. Yet the evidence written in stone tells a different story. Fossilized skin, preserved by chance in the right sands and clays, carries traces of microscopic structures called melanosomes, tiny sacs that once held pigments. Their shapes, when studied through the lenses of modern microscopes, whisper what colors they once contained. Long and narrow melanosomes point to darker hues, while rounder ones reveal reds, yellows, and shimmering greens. Through these silent clues, scientists have begun to see the Triassic in color. The scales of reptiles may have caught the light in copper tones, shimmering with iridescent blues along their flanks. Early dinosaurs, small and quick, might have flashed patterns of red and gold to warn rivals or attract mates. The first pterosaurs, drifting across the evening sky, could have had wings marked with pale streaks or subtle gradients, glinting as the sunlight passed through them. Even the plants, once sparse and gray after the great extinction, now filled the landscape with the soft greens of ginkgos and the deep emerald of cycads. This was not the dull world often imagined in old illustrations. It was alive with contrast and motion, a living canvas of scales, feathers, and leaves reflecting light in every shade the sun could give. Color, however, was only half of the story. For the first time in millions of years, the world had also become loud, not with the chaos of destruction, but with communication. Before the Triassic, sound had existed mostly as noise, the rush of wind, the flow of water, the calls of simple amphibians echoing across swamps. But now, a new kind of voice was forming. The archosaurs, those early ancestors of birds and crocodiles, were among the first to discover resonance. Their skulls and throats evolved hollow chambers where air could vibrate and deepen a call. Fossil evidence of these cavities hints that they could produce low, powerful sounds, the kind that rolled across plains and trembled through the ground. Picture a Triassic dawn. The first light spills over a forest of cycads and conifers. From a riverbank, a large reptile lifts its head and lets out a low bellow that vibrates through the mist. In the trees above, small lizards answer with rapid trills. Farther away, the echo of a pterosaur's call glides through the air, long and wavering. The world, once quiet, had learned to speak in rhythm. Even the insects added their notes. Beetles clicked and scraped against bark. Early cicadas pulsed their wings in steady beats. The hum of life rose and fell like a tide, creating an atmosphere that was as much heard as it was seen. Sight and sound together began to shape behavior. Bright colors could now warn or entice. Deep calls could mark territory or call to mates. In this new age, survival was not just about strength or speed. It was about communication, recognition, and display. The sensory world had become complex, alive with meaning. Among the smaller dinosaurs and early mammals, hearing itself began to evolve with new precision. Tiny bones within the ear shifted and thinned, allowing these creatures to pick up a wider range of frequencies. The night, once a place of silence, became filled with whispers, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of distant predators, the soft chirp of insects moving in the dark. For the mammals that hid in burrows and undergrowth, this sensitivity became their greatest advantage. They could hear danger before it arrived. In this growing web of perception, evolution found new directions. A creature's world was no longer defined only by what it could touch or smell, but by what it could see and hear. Life had expanded its awareness, painting the air with light and sound. The Triassic world, viewed through this lens, feels almost modern. Color and voice were tools that would never be lost again. They would be refined, amplified, and reinvented, from the scales of reptiles to the feathers of birds, from the roars of dinosaurs to the songs of whales and humans. The legacy of that sensory awakening still flows through every creature that communicates today. Imagine standing in that ancient forest, eyes half closed. You would feel the warmth of filtered sunlight on your skin, hear the layered sounds of movement all around, the croak of distant amphibians, the steady rhythm of insect wings, the soft thud of something large walking nearby. A pterosaur glides overhead, its wings catching glimmers of gold and blue. A small reptile scurries up a tree, its scales reflecting light like wet stone. Everything moves with purpose, every color and sound part of a living orchestra older than memory. In this way, the Triassic was not just the age when life recovered, it was when life found its beauty again, in pigment, in vibration, in voice. The silence of extinction had ended, replaced by a planet that could once more shimmer and sing. And from those colors and echoes, the pattern of all future life was written, a world no longer quiet, but alive with conversation. As the Triassic world continued to grow and divide, something quiet and extraordinary began to take shape in the patterns of life. It was not a change of bone or scale, nor of color or sound, but of mind. For the first time, creatures began to move together not just by chance, but by choice. Across the red plains of Pangia, under skies thick with warmth and drifting clouds, herds began to form. Their movements were deliberate, their paths etched into the soft mud of riverbanks and floodplains. Fossil trackways preserve these ancient journeys, long trails of footprints pressed into the earth by animals walking side by side, their steps in rhythm, their direction shared. These traces tell of a new kind of intelligence, one that reached beyond instinct, beyond the simple urge to flee or feed. It was the birth of cooperation, of life learning to think as a group. The herds were led by the great herbivores, early dinosaurs like Plateosaurus, their long necks rising above the trees. Moving together offered safety. Many eyes meant many warnings. While one fed, another watched the horizon. When the scent of danger drifted on the wind, the herd moved as one, their heavy feet rumbling across the soil in a living wave. For smaller animals, the same principle applied in gentler form. Groups of early reptiles and mammal-like creatures gathered near water holes, sharing burrows or sheltering in the shade together. It was not friendship in the sense we understand today, but a practical alliance born of need. In a world where predators watched every movement, even a few extra seconds of warning could mean survival. But it was not only the prey that learned to move together. Predators, too, were changing. In the fossil record, the story of cooperation can be traced in the bones of hunters, the teeth marks, the trackways, the patterns of attack. Some of the early carnivorous dinosaurs, lean and quick, left behind evidence that suggests coordination. Their prints overlap and circle, surrounding the tracks of a single herbivore. Whether by instinct or by planning, they had begun to work as a team. It is here, in these scattered clues, that the first hints of strategy appear. A single predator could ambush, but a group could chase, divide, and corner. It required patience, awareness, a sense of timing shared among individuals who could not yet speak, but somehow understood. Perhaps it began with family groups, parents and offspring hunting together, learning to read each other's movements. Over time, such cooperation may have deepened into structure, each member of a group knowing their role, each one moving according to the signals of the others. The Triassic world, once ruled by instinct alone, was becoming a place of relationships. To live socially was to depend on others. It required memory and recognition, trust and restraint. A creature had to understand who belonged and who did not, when to fight and when to yield. This gave rise to new kinds of awareness, small sparks of understanding that would one day shape the complex societies of birds, mammals, and humans. The earliest forms of this awareness were likely simple: a mother recognizing the scent of her young, a herd leader remembering safe paths to water, a hunter knowing when to wait for its partner's movement before striking. But those moments of connection formed the beginning of something far greater, a shared consciousness that lived not in one body, but in many. Picture a scene from that age. A herd of small, two-legged herbivores moves across a plain under a copper sky. Dust rises behind them in soft clouds, the air humming with insects. Far off, a group of predators watches, silent and still. The lead hunter lowers its head, signaling with a flick of its tail. The others fan out, each taking a position along the herd's edge. When they move, it is almost wordless, coordinated through rhythm and motion, the beginning of strategy carved in muscle and instinct. The hunt is swift, brutal, and brief. The herd scatters, then reforms, circling the young in a tight cluster. When the danger passes, they move on together, their formation restored. Both sides have learned, both have adapted. The balance of predator and prey now depends not just on strength or speed, but on cooperation, on unity. Even in the smaller corners of the world, this pattern repeated itself. In the burrows of early mammals, social behavior evolved in miniature. They huddled together for warmth, shared food, and took turns guarding their tunnels. Some species may have communicated with soft chirps or scents, leaving signals to mark safe paths or warn of danger. Life was no longer a collection of isolated struggles. It had become a tapestry of connections, of individuals linked through behavior, memory, and purpose. Each creature shaped the fate of the others, weaving the first fragile threads of community into the living fabric of Earth. And through this quiet invention of social life, the planet itself began to think in a new way. Every flock, every herd, every hunting pack became a kind of shared mind, sensing, reacting, and surviving together. The world had grown not only more alive, but more aware. In the soft heat of the Triassic dusk, as the last light faded and the sounds of movement filled the air, life was no longer solitary. It had learned the power of many hearts, beating as one, and in that rhythm, the future of intelligence had begun to stir. As the Triassic sun dipped below the horizon each evening, the land changed its rhythm. The air, thick with heat by day, cooled to a gentle stillness. Winds drifted softly through the forests, stirring the fronds of cycads and the tall needles of conifers. The great reptiles that ruled the daylight grew quiet, their heavy steps fading into the distance. And in the hush that followed, another world awoke. It was a world of shadows and whispers, a hidden realm where small, quick lives moved carefully beneath the cover of darkness. Among the roots and fallen branches, the first true mammals began their long, quiet reign. They were not the rulers of this world, not yet, but they had found a way to survive within it. Daytime belonged to the reptiles. Their blood ran with heat from the sun, their bodies built for open light and fierce competition. So the mammals learned to step aside, to wait, to live by patience instead of power. When dusk fell and the sky deepened into indigo, they emerged one by one, silent and watchful, carrying within them the future of all warm-blooded life. They were small, no larger than mice or shrews, yet their survival depended on gifts no other creatures possessed. Evolution had turned their weakness, their size, their fragility into something more. Their bodies grew warm from within. Unlike the reptiles that relied on sunlight to heat their blood, mammals created their own fire. Even when the air grew cold, their hearts beat steady, their temperature constant. This internal warmth allowed them to hunt, to move, to live freely in the dark when the world around them cooled into silence. And with warmth came sensitivity. Their senses grew sharper, tuned to the faintest motion, the softest sound. Their eyes, though small, began to adapt to the low light, catching the pale glimmer of the moon on leaves and water. Inside their ears, tiny bones vibrated with precision, translating even the rustle of an insect's wing into meaning. The mammals had learned to listen to the night as if it were a language. Fur became their armor against the chill. Each strand, fine and dense, trapped the warmth their bodies produced. The first coats of hair were simple, but they marked a revolution, an invention that would define an entire class of life. In the moonlight, their fur caught the faint silver glow, soft and quiet, blending them into the shadows. They hunted in secret, not for conquest, but for sustenance. Tiny teeth, sharp and efficient, sliced through the shells of insects and the soft bodies of worms. Their movements were deliberate, never wasted. A pause, a flick of the nose, a step forward. Their world was one of stillness interrupted by brief, precise motion, a choreography of caution. Each sense worked together in harmony. Smell guided them to food. Touch helped them navigate the undergrowth. Hearing warned them of danger before sight could confirm it. They became experts in survival through silence, slipping through the unseen spaces of a world ruled by giants. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly, cold and bright. The night stretched endless, yet it was never empty. The calls of insects pulsed in rhythm. The soft croak of amphibians echoed from distant pools. Occasionally, the heavy breath of a reptilian predator stirred the air, and every small mammal froze, hearts pounding beneath layers of fur, waiting until stillness returned. These nights were not peaceful, but they were patient, and patience became the mammal's greatest strength. While reptiles ruled the light, burning their energy beneath the sun, the mammals endured the long hours of darkness. Each generation refined the art of secrecy, quicker reflexes, quieter steps, keener senses. Their brains grew larger, their thoughts more flexible. They remembered where safety lay, where food could be found, when the predators slept. The mammalian story, in these early ages, was not one of dominance but of resilience. They learned to live not by strength, but by awareness. Every moment was a balance between motion and stillness, risk and refuge. They survived by understanding the world rather than overpowering it. If one could stand quietly in a Triassic night, listening carefully, the forest would seem alive in miniature. Leaves would shiver, though no wind blew. A pebble might roll, nudged by a creature smaller than a hand. The faint gleam of eyes might flash for an instant, then vanish. These were not accidents of the dark. They were lives unfolding in perfect secrecy. Beneath the gaze of sleeping dinosaurs, the mammals were writing their own quiet future. They would never roar across the land or soar through the skies. Instead, they whispered, they watched, they endured, and in their silence, evolution was building something profound, a mind capable of memory, a body capable of warmth, a lineage capable of waiting until the world changed again. The Triassic night belonged to them, not in dominance, but in persistence. They carried warmth through cold, motion through stillness, and awareness through shadow. While the world above them thundered with the weight of reptiles, these small, hidden survivors kept their fires burning in the dark. And when morning came, they disappeared once more into the roots and hollows, leaving no trace but the faint warmth of where they had been. The reptiles ruled the day, but in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, another kind of kingdom endured, one built on silence, patience, and the steady glow of life that would never again go out. Far from the noise of the continents, beyond the red deserts and young forests of the Triassic world, the oceans were stirring once more. For millions of years, they had been places of silence and recovery, green with chemical haze, heavy with life's absence. After the great dying, even the reefs, those delicate cities of the sea, had vanished. The limestone towers and coral forests that once laced the shallow waters were gone, their skeletons dissolved by acid tides. What remained was emptiness, a quiet seafloor waiting for life to return. But the earth has never kept still for long. Beneath the surface, change began in whispers. Tiny organisms, invisible to the naked eye, floated through the water, drifting with the currents. These were not yet corals as we know them, but their ancestors, microscopic architects of the future. They were single-celled builders, capable of taking the minerals dissolved in seawater and turning them into stone. Grain by grain, molecule by molecule, they began to rebuild the foundation of the marine world. The process was patient, almost invisible. Over thousands of years, these organisms settled in calm, shallow waters where sunlight could still reach the seafloor. Layer by layer, they built tiny domes and ridges of calcium carbonate At first, they were only small mounds, no taller than the height of a shell. But as generations passed, each new colony grew upon the ruins of the last, forming rising reefs that spread like slow, living continents beneath the waves. The water began to change as they grew. The new reefs calmed the motion of the tides, breaking the energy of waves that once churned the seafloor to dust. Silt and sand settled, clarity returned, sunlight filtered deeper, painting the underwater world in shifting patterns of gold and blue. Oxygen increased as photosynthetic life flourished once again, and with it came breath, a literal new breath for the ocean. Soon, the quiet waters filled with motion. Schools of fish, small and shimmering, wove through the coral towers. Crustaceans scuttled between the crevices, cleaning and feeding on the remains of passing life. Starfish spread across the reefs, their arms trailing softly in the current. Sponges anchored themselves to the coral walls, filtering water and adding color to the growing underwater cities. The ocean was no longer a desert. It was becoming a world of layers, of light and shadow, of structure and song. The coral kingdoms that rose during the Triassic were different from those that came before. They were sturdier, more complex, built not just by corals alone, but by entire partnerships of living things. Algae formed alliances with coral polyps, trading light for nutrients. Microbes filled the spaces between, stitching together life's foundation in threads unseen. Every inch of reef became a collaboration, a shared effort of survival and growth. These alliances would become one of nature's greatest inventions. Together, the small and the microscopic transformed chemistry into architecture. They turned water and sunlight into cities that could last for millions of years. The reefs became havens of stability, and that stability spread outward through the ocean. With the reefs came balance. Oxygen levels in the seas climbed higher, nourishing new forms of marine life. Predators evolved to hunt in the coral labyrinths, their bodies sleek and narrow for quick turns between narrow passages. Shelled creatures returned in dazzling variety, their colors and shapes molded by the safety and complexity of the reefs. Even the great marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs, were drawn to these shallows, where food was plentiful and the water shimmered with motion. Imagine drifting above such a reef during the late Triassic. The light dances through clear water, touching every coral with gentle fire. The reef itself hums with sound, the faint crackle of life, the soft movements of creatures feeding and hiding and repairing their homes. Fish with bright scales glide between coral towers. Delicate anemones wave in the current, their tendrils catching what the water brings. It is a world of color, of breath, of quiet construction, a world that feels as alive as the forests above, yet older and calmer, patient in its rhythm. The rise of the reefs marked a turning point not just for the oceans, but for all of Earth's ecosystems. Stability in the seas meant balance on land. The oxygen they produced spread across the planet, feeding weather patterns, cooling the climate, and supporting the breath of all living things. The Earth was beginning to resemble the modern world, complex, interwoven, and self-sustaining. Each coral colony, no larger than a fingertip, was part of something vast. Together they formed the foundations of life's second great marine age, proving that even after the most catastrophic extinction, creation can return stronger than before. The ocean had learned to heal itself, not through force, but through cooperation. As the sun set above the Triassic waters, the surface glowed with reflected gold. Beneath, the coral cities thrived unseen, working in silence, binding life back into harmony. From microorganisms came reefs, from reefs came ecosystems, and from those ecosystems came the living pulse of a planet reborn. The coral kingdoms would continue to grow for millions of years, rising and falling with the tides of time. Yet even in their fragility, they remained a symbol of endurance, proof that from stillness, beauty can bloom again, and from death, a world can learn to breathe. By the time the Triassic world had settled into its strange, warm rhythm, the land was no longer the only place where life thrived. The forests, the rivers, and the seas had all found their balance again. But above them all, there still lingered an open space untouched by claws or fins or footprints, a silent expanse of blue that stretched endlessly, waiting to be claimed. And then, slowly, it began to fill. From cliffs of red stone and coastlines of wind-carved dunes, creatures launched themselves into the air, wings outstretched, gliding over the glittering waters and forests below. They were the pterosaurs, the first true masters of the sky. Their rise marked one of evolution's boldest experiments. Unlike insects, which had long conquered the air with their delicate, buzzing wings, or birds that would one day come after, these new flyers were reptiles that had learned to fly not by inheritance, but by innovation. Their wings were vast membranes of skin stretched between elongated fingers and their slender bodies. When sunlight passed through them, the thin layers glowed with shades of amber, bronze, and gold. At first, they were small and cautious. Early species like Eudomorphodon glided from tree to tree, using the wind to lengthen their falls. Their bones were light and hollow, their muscles lean but powerful. Inside their chests, their lungs worked in a rhythm more complex than those of their earthbound relatives, pulling air through a series of sacs that kept oxygen flowing continuously. The same secret that once gave archosaurs their endurance on land now lifted their descendants into the air. Each new generation refined the design. Wings grew stronger, bodies lighter. The chest widened to hold powerful muscles that could drive a steady, beating flight. In time, the gliders became flyers, no longer bound by the pull of the ground. With the mastery of flight came freedom. The skies, once empty, now shimmered with motion. Pterosaurs learned to hunt above rivers, diving with precision to snatch fish from the surface. Others circled over forests, watching the shadows below for signs of movement. Their keen eyes could spot the glint of scales or the flutter of an insect from incredible distances. Not all were hunters. Some soared high and slow, drifting on warm air currents, feeding on carrion or small animals that wandered too close to the open ground. Others became scavengers of the shore, walking awkwardly along the sand before launching into the wind with powerful strokes. Each species carved its own niche into the vast openness above the world. The evolution of powered flight did not happen in isolation. It was a conversation between physics and life, between bone and air. To fly was to understand the invisible, to find balance in resistance and lift. Every beat of a pterosaur's wings was an answer to that eternal question of how to stay aloft when gravity never ceased its pull. In the warm updrafts rising from the deserts and cliffs, they found the key. Pterosaurs used the Earth's breath itself, the currents of heated air, to glide effortlessly for hours. Some reached wingspans of several meters, their silhouettes tracing wide arcs across the sky. From below, they would have appeared almost ghostly, passing silently through the sunlight, their shadows flickering across the ground like drifting leaves. As they multiplied, the sky grew busier. The air above the Triassic world became an ecosystem of its own, layered and alive. High above, large pterosaurs soared between the clouds, their wings casting moving patterns across the sea. Below them, smaller species flitted between the treetops, chasing insects or plucking fruit from branches. In coastal regions, young pterosaurs learned to fly by running against the wind until their feet left the ground, their first flights short but triumphant. The sight would have been astonishing, a sky once untouched now filled with hunters, scavengers, and wanderers, each moving with grace that only practice and necessity could create. The sun's reflection off their wings shimmered like the flash of water, and their cries, high, harsh, and echoing, gave the air its first true voice. Their bones, light as reeds, rarely survived the weight of time. Yet those that did tell a story, written in elegance, each joint, each curve, speaks of a creature built for movement without friction. They were the living embodiment of the principle that form follows freedom. The evolution of the pterosaurs would set a precedent that nature would revisit again and again. The idea of powered flight, of muscles that beat against the air, of skeletons made light by air sacs, of balance achieved in motion, would one day give rise to birds, and much later to bats. But in the Triassic, it was still new, still experimental, still daring. Life had conquered land and sea, but in these creatures, it had learned to conquer the invisible. The sky was no longer a void, but a home, a place where life could move with the sun, where it could follow the winds, and where survival depended not on hiding, but on soaring. As the day faded and the first stars appeared above the vast supercontinent, the silhouettes of the pterosaurs still drifted through the twilight. They glided in silence, wings catching the last glimmers of orange light, their shapes soft against the dimming horizon. Beneath them, the forests slept, the rivers stilled, and the earth itself seemed to watch in wonder as its children took to the air. The unexplored sky had been claimed, not through strength, but through the perfect balance of grace and possibility, a quiet reminder that even in a world still recovering from ruin, life would always find a way to rise. While sunlight painted the surface of the Triassic world in gold and red, another realm lay just below, untouched by wind or storm. It was a world of quiet persistence, a network of hidden corridors and secret chambers carved into the earth itself. Down here, far from the eyes of the great reptiles and the open heat of the sun, life found refuge and purpose once again. The soil was no longer barren. It had taken millions of years for it to regain its rhythm, for the minerals to mix with decay and root and water. Beneath the forests and plains, it had become alive, not just as dirt or dust, but as a breathing system, full of energy and exchange. Tiny roots from conifers and ferns reached downward, searching for moisture and stability. Fungi intertwined among them, weaving invisible threads through the ground. These delicate filaments carried nutrients from one root to another, forming an underground web of sharing and survival. The soil had become a silent conversation, spoken in minerals and sugars, linking the lives above with the unseen world below. Among these living tunnels moved creatures who had learned to trust the dark. Early mammals, small and warm, dug narrow burrows where they could rest and raise their young in safety. Their claws were strong, their bodies compact, their senses sharp. They carried heat in their blood, and they shared it in small huddles beneath the earth, away from predators that ruled the open world. When the night fell and the surface cooled, they would emerge quietly, scurrying in search of insects or fallen seeds. But when the morning came and the air shimmered with heat, they slipped back underground into the cool soil that shielded them from danger. In this rhythm of surface and shelter, of shadow and sun, the early mammals created the first true underground communities. They were not alone. Amphibians, too, had returned to the soil. Some were small descendants of ancient species that had once ruled the swamps before the Great Extinction. Now, they survived by adapting, burrowing deep during dry seasons, their moist skin pressed against cool mud. Their hearts slowed, their bodies waited, their existence tuned to the quiet pulse of the earth. When the rains came, they rose again, their calls echoing through the forests as reminders that water had returned, and with it, life. Insects and worms filled the spaces between. Beetles dug through decaying roots. Termite-like creatures built small chambers for their colonies. Worms turned the soil as they ate, enriching it with air and waste. Their movement transformed the ground into something new, fertile, porous, alive. Every tunnel they carved became a passage for oxygen, every chamber a seedbed for the next generation of roots. Even the fallen left their mark. When plants died, their stems softened and broke apart, feeding the network that sustained the living. The dead returned their minerals to the soil, and in doing so, made it richer. Every life, seen or unseen, became part of the same cycle of renewal. If one could travel through this world beneath the roots, it would not feel empty. The air would hum faintly with motion. The scent of damp earth would hang heavy, layered with the sweetness of decay and the musk of living bodies. Light would barely reach, but every creature within it would move with purpose, their lives quiet but vital. This was not the chaos of the surface, it was order through patience, creation through concealment. The forests above owed their strength to what lay below. The soil's living network fed them, anchoring their trunks against storms and droughts. Each raindrop that seeped into the ground carried life deeper, spreading nourishment through root and thread. Every fallen leaf became part of the same system that once fed its parent tree. Beneath the noise of predators and the flight of pterosaurs, this hidden world carried on, unseen yet indispensable. The burrowers had changed the planet in ways few would ever notice. They aerated the ground, making it easier for plants to grow. They kept the soil moist by digging pathways for water. Their waste fertilized the roots. Their bodies returned nutrients to the earth. What they did in darkness shaped the brightness above. Even as reptiles dominated the surface, as the great predators fought, and the herbivores grazed beneath ancient trees, the true foundation of life was being rebuilt underground. It was not ruled by speed or strength or size, but by endurance, by the quiet persistence of countless small creatures who turned soil into a living skin for the planet. In that hidden world, life had no need for spectacle. It thrived in the rhythm of decay and renewal, in the small exchanges that stitched the earth together. Beneath the roots of forests and the weight of time, the soil became a heart, slow, steady, and alive. Above, the forests swayed in the wind. Rivers wound their way through valleys, carrying silt that would one day feed new lands. And below it all, the unseen world continued its work, invisible but eternal. The ground itself was breathing again, filled with life that never sought the sun but kept the planet alive all the same. Every living thing that walked, swam, or flew would one day depend on what these hidden architects had made. In the quietest places, life had found its greatest strength, not in the open, but in the sheltering dark beneath our feet. Deep beneath the calm forests and sunlit oceans of the Triassic world, the planet's restlessness never truly stopped. Though life had rebuilt its kingdoms, though coral cities and forests now covered the scars of the past, Earth itself still moved with an ancient rhythm, slow, unyielding, and immense. The continents that had once fused into one colossal body, Pangia, were beginning to tear apart. It started quietly, deep under the crust, in places where the heat of the mantle pressed against weakness in the rock. The ground stretched and cracked, and liquid fire, trapped for ages beneath the surface, began to rise. The air trembled with distant rumbles that carried for hundreds of miles. Rivers were blocked and redirected as fissures opened across the land, releasing clouds of steam and gas. Where forests had stood, molten rock oozed into new valleys, cooling into black glass and ash. It was not the fiery chaos of the great dying long ago, but something more patient, a slow rearranging of the planet's bones. The rifts stretched across the heart of Pangaea, dividing the land into sections that drifted ever so slightly farther apart each year. Where the earth tore, vast new basins formed, filling with water from the rains and rivers. These would become the first outlines of new oceans, the early whispers of what would one day be the Atlantic. As the crust thinned, the deep heat of the mantle reached closer to the surface. Volcanic fields spread across what is now Africa, South America, and Europe. The eruptions released vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, more than the world had felt in millions of years. The air grew heavier, warmer. Seasons became unpredictable again. In some regions, deserts expanded as rainfall faltered. In others, floods returned where once the land had been dry. The forests that had so patiently reclaimed the earth began to feel the strain. Trees, especially the great conifers and cycads that had spread through the Triassic world, adapted as best they could. Some grew thicker bark to withstand drier air. Others sent roots deeper, searching for moisture that still lingered underground. But the temperature kept climbing. The carbon released by the new volcanoes lingered like an invisible blanket, trapping the sun's warmth. Far from the rifting zones, the world still pulsed with life. The seas shimmered with color, the skies hummed with the wings of pterosaurs, and the land trembled with the steps of dinosaurs, growing in size and confidence. Yet the atmosphere was changing quietly above them. In the oceans, the rising carbon dioxide began to seep into the water. It reacted with minerals, softening the shells of small plankton and corals. Near volcanic shores, the water hissed faintly with gas, bubbling through reefs that were once pristine. For now, the damage was subtle, more of a whisper than a wound, but the balance of chemistry was shifting again. The planet was entering one of its long transitions, one that few living things could perceive but all would eventually feel. Some regions grew tropical, lush with rain and heat. Giant amphibians returned to swampy lowlands, basking in warm pools under dense canopies. Crocodile relatives flourished in the wetlands, gliding through green waters and nesting along the shores. In these places, life thrived, unaware of the forces brewing beneath its feet. Elsewhere, the air grew thick and dry. Vast dunes moved across the interior of the continents, swallowing the remains of rivers that once carved their way through fertile valleys. Herds of early herbivorous dinosaurs, like Plateosaurus and its kin, wandered through these empty lands, their long necks sweeping over the sand for sparse patches of fern and seed plant. Their tracks pressed deep into the shifting soil, only to vanish under the next gust of wind. Volcanoes at the edges of the rifts burned with a dull, endless glow. Ash drifted slowly through the air, settling over. Forests like gray snow, it muted sound, softened light, and cloaked the world in a strange stillness. For the creatures that lived nearby, the sun would often rise red through a haze of dust, painting the landscape in colors of copper and ember. Each eruption fed the air with more carbon, the planet's own breath growing faster and hotter. The cycle was ancient and natural, a breathing of continents, but this time the scale was enormous. Every pulse of magma from below marked another step toward a new world, one of separated lands and evolving climates. Yet the Triassic world endured. Life, having already survived the worst catastrophe in Earth's history, adapted once again. The reefs persisted, the forests shifted with the winds, the animals moved, changed, and learned. The planet had entered another stage of becoming, its surface breaking apart to make way for new possibilities. Far above the trembling crust, pterosaurs rode the thermal currents rising from the rift valleys. The heat from below lifted them effortlessly higher, their wings gliding on the invisible breath of the earth. From that height, the landscape stretched endlessly, mountains splitting apart, rivers curving through new valleys, the scars of fresh volcanoes glowing faintly in the dusk. The world was changing again, not with sudden violence, but through steady, unstoppable motion. Every ridge that rose, every plate that drifted, every bubble of gas that escaped into the air was part of a quiet preparation. The earth was setting its stage once more, as it always did, shaping the surface for new ages of life to come. But for now, amid the sound of distant eruptions and the soft hum of wind through red canyons, the planet exhaled in slow, glowing breaths, alive, restless, and endlessly in motion. The Triassic world, after millions of years of recovery and rebirth, had reached a strange kind of balance. The forests had returned, the seas teemed with life, and creatures of every shape now walked, swam, or flew across the earth. To the eye, it was a thriving planet, the deserts breathing with rain, the oceans glowing with plankton, the skies alive with the beating of wings. Yet beneath that beauty, an invisible fragility had begun to spread, a quiet imbalance that even the winds could not disguise. Life had rebuilt itself so completely that it began once more to press against the limits of its own design. The predators had grown enormous, built for dominance rather than endurance. The herbivores towered over the plains, their bodies vast and heavy, demanding endless fields of food to sustain them. The seas, though full again, were ruled by specialized hunters who depended on narrow chains of prey. Every ecosystem had become a tapestry of precision, intricate, efficient, but brittle. Evolution, in its creativity, had made specialists, and specialization, though powerful, left little room for error. On the river plains, herds of plesiosaurs wandered between the forests, their long necks sweeping in slow arcs over the ferns. They were among the largest creatures the world had ever seen, using their sheer size as protection from predators. But such magnificence came at a cost. They needed vast amounts of vegetation to survive. Even the smallest shift in rainfall or temperature could starve them. In the shallows, the ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs hunted with precision and grace. Their streamlined bodies moved through the water like silver blades, their eyes vast and unblinking. But they, too, lived on the edge of stability. Their food webs were narrow, built on the delicate balance of smaller fish and plankton that depended on the temperature and chemistry of the seas. A single disruption, a current change, a bloom of algae, a drop in oxygen could send ripples through the entire oceanic chain. Even the skies, so recently conquered, were no longer empty havens of opportunity. Pterosaurs soared above the coasts, masters of the air, yet they too had adapted to very specific niches. Some hunted over water, others scavenged the shorelines. Their survival depended on patterns of climate and tide that were beginning, once again, to shift. The Earth's surface, meanwhile, was far from still. The slow tearing of Pangia continued, splitting the continents with widening rifts. Volcanoes along the seams of this great divide spewed out gases that reached high into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels began to climb again. For a time, the planet absorbed the change gracefully. The forests grew thicker, feeding on the extra carbon. But the warmth kept rising. Rain patterns began to falter. Some regions drowned in storms that lasted for months. Others dried into endless drought. Inland lakes shrank into salt plains, and rivers that had once fed vast valleys turned to shallow, cracked beds. The Earth's climate, though still livable, was beginning to fluctuate in wild, unpredictable rhythms. At first, the creatures of the Triassic adapted, as they always had. Some migrated toward the coasts, following the humid winds. Others evolved smaller bodies, faster metabolisms, and sharper senses. But the pace of change was faster now, and the world's intricate web began to strain. The great reptiles, once symbols of power, found themselves bound by their own success. Their bodies were too large to cool easily, their lungs too slow to cope with the thinning balance of gases. The oceans, warmed by trapped heat, began to lose oxygen, and dead zones spread like faint shadows across the seafloor. In the fossil record, this transition leaves a whisper rather than a roar. Species vanish not in great cataclysms, but in silence, one lineage at a time, fading as the conditions that once favored them disappeared. The reefs lost builders, the plains lost grazers. The predators that had ruled the food chain lost their prey, and soon followed them into absence. And yet, even as old forms vanished, new ones were quietly emerging. Among the smaller reptiles, the first true dinosaurs were beginning to diversify. They were light, quick, adaptable, able to thrive in the new climates. While the old giants struggled to survive, these smaller creatures darted through the cracks of a changing world, taking the spaces others left behind. The paradox of the late Triassic was that it seemed peaceful. The forests still swayed, the seas still shimmered, and the skies still carried the silhouettes of pterosaurs drifting on the wind. But beneath that illusion of stability, life had grown brittle, locked into forms too perfect for a world that refused to stay still. In the soil, carbon built up quietly. In the air, heat gathered slowly. The continents crept farther apart, carrying their forests and deserts into new latitudes. What seemed like balance was, in truth, a pause, a breath before the next great change. And so the Triassic lingered, poised between triumph and collapse. It was a world alive with color, sound, and movement, yet one that carried within it the faint tremor of something nearing its end. The great age that had risen from ashes was beginning to falter, not through violence, but through its own fragile perfection. Beneath the skies of a warming world, the earth once again turned toward transformation. The seas, the land, and the creatures upon them would soon face another reckoning. But for now, the forests were still green, the oceans still blue, and the planet still breathing, quietly, delicately, holding on to its balance in the final calm before the storm. By the time the Triassic world neared its quiet close, the Earth had become something entirely new. The age that began in fire and silence had transformed into a planet bursting with life in every direction, on land, in the air, and beneath the sea. The scars of the great dying had long since faded, replaced by forests, coral reefs, and living forms that hinted at what was still to come. From the strange experiments of that restless age, the blueprints of the modern world began to take shape. It was in this time that life learned its patterns again, how to build balance, how to create chains of dependence, how to fill every space with purpose. From small, burrowing mammals to towering herbivorous dinosaurs, every creature played a part in reweaving the fabric that had once been torn apart. The Triassic was not only an age of recovery, it was a rehearsal for everything that followed. In the shallows of ancient coastlines, the oceans had regained their rhythm. Coral reefs had returned, not the same as before, but built by new architects, organisms that learned to thrive in warmer, more unstable waters. Around them swam schools of fish that darted in perfect harmony, their scales catching sunlight that rippled through the waves. Among them glided the ichthyosaurs, streamlined and confident, their movements a promise of what marine predators would one day become. They were the early masters of the deep, setting the stage for sharks, whales, and other rulers of the seas that would follow in ages yet unborn. On land, the balance of power had shifted firmly into reptilian hands. The archosaurs had diversified into countless forms. Some took to the skies with thin wings stretched between elongated fingers. Others grew thick limbs and armored hides, stalking through forests and river banks. They learned to walk upright, to breathe deeply, to move faster and farther than anything before them. Yet, From these same reptilian roots, other lineages began to branch away. The first, true dinosaurs, small and light footed, were no longer bound to the ground's heavy crawl. Their bones were hollow, their movements sharp, their blood warm with energy. They were not yet the giants of the later Jurassic, but in them lay the spark of what would come, the rhythm of steps that would one day echo across every continent. Among the shadows, the mammals watched and waited. Small, fur-covered, and clever, they had learned to thrive in the darkness when the air cooled and predators slept. They nursed their young, cared for them, and learned the patience that would carry their kind through the ages. Though they were not yet the dominant force, they were already something remarkable, the quiet architects of tomorrow. Even the skies were not untouched by this transformation. The first pterosaurs ruled above, their wings whispering through the air like silk. Their bones were hollow, their lungs efficient, their bodies light and full of power. They turned the heavens into a hunting ground, teaching life to see the world in 3 dimensions. In their fragile frames lay the beginnings of what would one day become birds, creatures that would inherit the skies after the age of reptiles faded away. Beneath all this movement, the plants continued their slow revolution. The forests of the Triassic were filled with conifers, cycads, and ginkgos, plants that could survive heat, drought, and poor soil. They shaped the air itself, drawing in carbon and breathing out oxygen, maintaining the fragile balance that allowed the animals to flourish. With their deep roots and tall canopies, they stabilized the land, protecting the soil from the winds and the sun. They were the silent foundation of every living system. The Triassic world was unlike anything that came before. It was not simply an age of reptiles, but a vast and living laboratory, an experiment in survival, adaptation, and design. Here, life tested the extremes of form and function. It built predators with bodies shaped like spears and prey with armor like stone. It learned the value of speed, flight, and intelligence. And out of all that chaos and creativity, the patterns of the modern world began to crystallize. By the end of the Triassic, nearly every great lineage that still defines life today had already emerged. Mammals had taken their first quiet breaths in the shadows. Birds had been written into the bones of their ancestors. The reptiles had stretched into every niche, from the rivers to the deserts to the open sky. Even amphibians and fish, though no longer rulers, held their ancient places in the story, bridging the past to the future. If one could stand in that world and look closely, the familiar outlines would already be visible. The food webs, the predator-prey dances, the rhythms of migration and growth, they all took root here. The Triassic was a crucible, shaping not only creatures but the very systems that sustain life. It taught the planet to breathe again, and through all its trials, from extinction to rebirth, the Earth carried one truth forward, that life is not a straight path, but a series of experiments, each one learning from the last. The reptiles rose and ruled, but in doing so, they laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The legacy of their age endures not only in the fossils buried deep within the rock, but in every bird that takes flight, every mammal that warms its blood, and every creature that depends on the balance of air, water, and light. In the quiet turning of that ancient age, the earth had rewritten its story. From fire and ruin, it had drawn a new blueprint, one that would guide the planet's living heart for the rest of time. The end of the Triassic was not a fall, but a culmination. The world that had clawed its way back from extinction now stood transformed, humming with movement and sound. From ocean depths to desert plains, from dense forests to the endless blue above, life had spread into every corner of the planet once more. It was not a quiet ending, nor a peaceful one, but a grand moment of completion, the point when life, after nearly dying out, had finally reclaimed the earth. The reptiles, born from the heat and struggle of recovery, now ruled everything the light touched. They swam through the oceans, walked across continents, and soared through the skies. Their reign was not an accident. It was the result of a world reshaped by fire, by pressure, by time itself. The Triassic had been their proving ground, and they had passed every test. In the seas, ichthyosaurs moved like living arrows, sleek and strong, slicing through the dark waters in silence. Their large eyes captured the faintest shimmer of prey, their bodies twisting in elegant bursts of speed. They had become the ocean's masters, the first reptiles to take the sea as their true home. Not far behind them glided the plesiosaurs, with long necks that curved through the water like serpents. Together, they remade the marine world, hunting where fish once ruled, birthing their young in the open water. No longer did life have to return to the shore to begin anew. The ocean itself had become a cradle again. Across the land, the archosaurs, the great reptilian dynasty, held dominion. Some stood tall on powerful hind legs, scanning the wind for scent or motion. Others crawled low to the ground, armored and silent, their scales glinting like metal under the sun. In the forests, small, quick dinosaurs darted between ferns and roots, their bodies light and agile, their minds alert to every sound. Predators stalked them in the tall grass, their teeth curved for slicing, their feet built for running. It was a world alive, with pursuit and escape, each creature shaping the other through the endless rhythm of survival. The air itself had become another frontier. The pterosaurs, once awkward gliders, now soared with confidence. Their wings stretched wide across the orange skies of the late Triassic, carrying them over rivers, mountains, and plains. They dove for fish, circled above herds, and nested on high cliffs that touched the clouds. From the ground, their silhouettes passed across the sun like spirits in flight. No creature had ever truly owned the sky before. Now, the reptiles claimed even that. The Triassic world, in its final moments, was alive with power. It was a planet of bold designs and endless invention. Every ecosystem thrived on complexity. The oceans rippled with predators and prey. The forests echoed with the calls of reptiles and the whisper of insects returning to the canopy. Even the smallest mammals, hidden in burrows and shadows, played their part in this vast orchestra of life. The earth had become a masterpiece of balance, fleeting, fragile, and magnificent. But beneath the triumph, the planet itself continued to shift. The continents were still drifting apart, pulling open rifts that released fire and gas into the air. Volcanoes burned along the seams of Pangia, their plumes rising like dark pillars against the sky. Ash fell softly over forests and seas, a reminder that the world, though alive, was never still. Yet even this did not silence the age. Life had become too resilient, too deeply rooted. The fires that had once ended nearly everything could no longer unmake what had been built. As the Triassic drew to its close, its legacy had already been written in stone and bone. The blueprints of the modern world were in place. The reptiles had shaped the planet's future, teaching life how to move, how to breathe, how to rise above the ground. Their bodies carried the secrets of warm blood and powerful lungs, of swift movement and endurance. From their forms would come the creatures that would one day fill the world, the great dinosaurs of the Jurassic, the birds of the skies, and even the mammals that would inherit the earth long after the giants had fallen. What had begun as recovery after disaster had become creation on a scale no one could have imagined. The Triassic was the bridge between ruin and renewal, the chapter where life reinvented itself completely. It was the age when Earth turned its wounds into strength, when destruction became the root of diversity. And so, the world turned once more, carrying its strange new rulers across the dawn of another era. The skies shimmered with flight, the oceans glittered with movement, the land trembled under the steps of creatures that had risen from the ashes of the past to claim the future. The Triassic did not end with silence, but with triumph, a celebration written in scale and bone, in air and water, in the endless persistence of life itself. From the quiet dust of extinction, the reptiles had become architects of the living world, shaping every kingdom of earth with their bodies and their breath. They had conquered sea, land, and sky, leaving a legacy that would echo for hundreds of millions of years. Life began again, not as it was, but as something entirely new. And from this second beginning, the world we know began to take shape.